The final chapters begin. Letter to Britain and the U.S. 1871 Corporation. There are only 198 nations in this world, and 197 are now working with us. The last nation to enter was the United States and omnibus people, the indigenous people of this land. Since Britain controls the U.S. 1871 Corporation, you are essentially one nation, and you are now standing alone against the entire world. They are throwing off your control and refuse to allow you to subjugate them any longer. Following is the truth of where we are according to Yahweh's word. Revelations 17, New King James Version. The scarlet woman and the scarlet beast. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot, who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the merits of Christ. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amusement. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The seven heads are the seven mountains on which the woman sits. The great harlot is Queen Elizabeth, and the seven mountains represents Rome, the seat of the Vatican. Elizabeth had had control of Vatican, and both were charged with global financial terrorism and human trafficking in October 2012 by the International Criminal Court of Justice. Both were found guilty of all charges, which is why the Pope stepped down, and both he and Elizabeth are under house arrest. This is also why the new Pope has not moved into the papal apartments. Her kingdom sat across many waters, and as the Nephilim Draco she is, she participated in human sacrifice and drinking the blood of those sacrificed. Then he said to me, The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are people, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot and make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For the Lord has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast, until the words of the Lord are fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. The nation of the world are contained in the 10 horns. These nations now are throwing off the control of Queen Elizabeth and the Vatican. Edom is the great city which has reigned over the kings of the earth. Revelations 18, the fall of Babylon the Great. After these things I saw another angel coming down from the heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great has fallen, is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, and a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and the Lord has rendered her iniquities. Render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. In the cup which he has mixed double for her. In the measure that she hath glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow. For she says in her heart, I sit as queen and am no widow, and will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day, and death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord who judges her. The righteous city of Edom are asked to come out of her. Elizabeth in her arrogance will be brought down as the Lord judges her. The world mourns Babylon's fall, and the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of object of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble, and cinnamon and incense, fragrant and oil and frankincense, wine and oil, fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots. That's what we're going through now. And bodies and souls of men. The fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you, and all the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. The merchants of these things who become rich by her, and will stand at a distance to fear of her torment, weeping and wailing and saying, Alas, alas, that great city that has clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. For in an hour such great riches came to nothing. Every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What is this? Is like this great city? As the old fiat monetary system is stripped of its power and shut down, no one will participate in the merchandise of that old system anymore. The city of Edom will be destroyed in the Lord's wrath. Okay. Jeremiah 13:18 says, Say to the king and to the queen mother, Humble yourselves and sit down, for your rule shall collapse in the crown of your glory. Thus the Lord has said to the King Pope and Queen Mother Elizabeth, Sit down, and their rule has collapsed. We, the people of the universe, will no longer be forced, nor coerced and threatened in cooperating in your criminal activity. So we are abiding by the laws of the universe and taking by force what belongs to us and are no longer begging for it. We are separating ourselves and going into our land to serve the Lord. Beware of judgment of the Lord is coming, and no one can hide from his wrath. Even though you call for the rocks to fall on you and hide from his face, the Lord will not answer. Yeah, so that's that right here. And then, what page is this? Okay. So this is what I'm going to be reading for just a couple pages. Government instituted slavery using franchises. Again, the devil took Christ up on an exceeding high civil legal status above all other humans, mountain, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their glory. And he said to him, All these things, benefits, I will give you, if you will fall down below Satan, but above other humans, and worship, serve as a public officer me. Then Christ said to him, Away with you, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord, and him only you shall serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and ministered to him. The Lord brought you up from Egypt's slavery and brought you to the land of which I swore to your fathers and said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant, contract, or franchise, or agreement of any kind with the inhabitants of this corrupt pagan land. You shall tear down their man-government worshipping socialist altars, but you have not obeyed me. Why have you done this? Therefore, I said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns, terrorists, and prosecutors in your side, and their gods will be a snare, slavery to you. So it was when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel that the people lifted up their voices and wept. You shall make no covenant, contract, or franchise with them foreigner pagans, nor with their pagan government gods, laws, or judges. They shall not dwell in your land, and you shall not dwell in theirs, by becoming a resident and domiciliary in the process of contracting with them, lest they make you sin against the Lord. For if you have served their government gods under contract or agreement or franchise, it will surely be a snare to you. For among the Lord's people are found wicked, covetous, public servant men. They lie in wait as one who sets snares. They set a trap, they catch men as a cage is full of birds. So their houses are full of deceit. Therefore they have become great and grown rich. They have grown fat and they are sleek. Yes, they surpass the deeds of the wicked. They do not plead the cause of the fatherless or the innocent widow or the non-taxpayer. Yet they prosper in the right of the needy. They do not defend. Shall I not punish them for these things? Says the Lord, shall I not avenge myself on such a nation as this? An astonishing and horrible thing has been committed in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests, judges, and franchise courts that worship government as pagans' deity, ruled by their own power and by people love to have it so. But what will you do in the end? The taxpayer, that's someone who works for the Fed Gov, who doesn't have to take the civil service examination. President Ronald W. Reagan. In the matter of taxation, every privilege is an injustice. Okay, the more you want privileges, the more the world can hurt you. Confucius. The Lord is well pleased for his righteous sake. He will exalt the law and make it honorable. But this is a people robbed and plundered. All of them are snared in legal holes by the sophistry of greedy government lawyers, and they are hidden in prison houses. They are for prey, and no one delivers for plunder, and no one says restore. Well, I say restore. Who among you will give ear to this? Who will listen and hear for the time to come? Who gave Jacob for plunder and Israel to the robbers? Was it not the Lord? He against whom we have sinned? For they would not walk in his ways, nor were they obedient to his law. Therefore, he has poured on him the fury of his anger and the strength of battle. It has set him on fire all around. Yet he did not know, and it burned him. Yet he did not take it to heart. Awake, awake, O Zion. Clothe yourself with strength. Put on your garments of splendor, O Jerusalem, the holy city. The uncircumcised and defiled will not enter you again. Shake off your dust and rise up. Sit enthroned, O Jerusalem. Free yourself from the chains, contracts, and franchises on your neck, O captive daughter of Zion. For this is what the Lord says. You were sold for nothing. Free government cheese worth a fraction of what you had to pay them to earn the right to eat it. And without money, you will be redeemed. The most pernicious form of tyranny is that which is justified with the defense that it is good for you or benefits you. Bob Schultz, We the People Foundation for Constitutional Education. Okay, what would Jesus do? I try to imagine my Lord filling out an application for a license of some sort. I try to imagine my Lord being statutory citizen when he said to his tax collector apostle Matthew that he had no domicile. He also said that all his followers were to the enemies rather than the friends of the world, and that he chose his followers to be legally, civilly outside rather than inside the world. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of domiciled within the world, but I, Christ, chose you, believers, out of the world. Therefore, the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a public servant is not greater than his sovereign master. If they prosecute me, they will also prosecute you. If they kept my word, they will keep yours also, as a trustee of the public trust. But all these things they will do to you for my name's sake, because they do not know the Lord who sent me. Adulteresses and adulterers, or the opposite. Do you not know that friendship and citizenship domicile with the world or the government of the world is enmity with the Lord? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend, statutory citizen, or taxpayer, or resident, or inhabitant of the world makes himself an enemy of the Lord. I tried to imagine my Lord writing down a social number when trying to open a bank account. I tried to imagine my Lord saying the Pledge of Allegiance when the only mention of allegiance in the Bible was connected with sin. And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul, the king God, told them not to elect or accept, had placed the people under oath. I tried to imagine my Lord holding on to a birth certificate in some undisclosed location to be able to receive it when asked. Retrieve it. Who are you? We need proof that you are our public officer, statutory employee, and or gov dependent. I tried to imagine my Lord getting a passport from Caesar to travel somewhere else on his father's property. Shouldn't the gov be scorning God's laws for permission and a license to use Lord's property for the purpose they intend? Aren't they in effect abusing property taxes to rent out someone else's Lord's property, meaning stolen property? I try to imagine my Lord sending his children believers to gov-controlled educational systems, public school. Even animals are not stupid enough to turn their young over to predators. He calls them the beast in Revelations 19, to be raised. I try to imagine what my Lord truly means when he spoke these words. And I appoint unto you a kingdom, even as my Father appointed unto me. You, Christ, are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and you have redeemed us, believers, to Lord by your blood, out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and have made us kings and priests to our Lord, and we shall reign on the earth. Revelations 5:9-10. I try to imagine what is truly meant when Paul writes, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of the Lord. I try to imagine if my Lord would have any concern at all of a license from Caesar, Herod maybe, whom he called a fox. I try to imagine if my Lord would accept a marked number by a man-made gov. He called gov the beast in Revelations 19:19. Do not all licenses come with some form of a number? I try to imagine if my Lord is speaking to people who accepted a social number or worshiped the image ruler found on Caesar's money when he said the following: First bowl loathsome sores. So the first went and poured out his bowl upon the earth, and a foul and loathsome sore came upon the men who had the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. Revelation 16:2. Show me the tax money. So they brought him a denarius. And he, Christ, the same guy who wrote the above, said to them, whose image and inscriptions is this? They said to him, Caesar's. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, with which they have forsaken me and served and worshipped other gods, kings in this case, so they are doing to you also, government becoming idolatry. I often wonder if the opposition is implied in this verse, to which I am sure. Yea, in all that I will live godly in Christ shall suffer prosecution. I imagine and wonder and think on these things daily to remind myself always, here it is what has been revealed. My Lord came to us as an example for us all, to show us how to live and to die, for it is written, for whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loves his life for my sake will find it. I try to imagine the meaning of Christians being a light on a hill that cannot be hid, and then I realized the light spoken of in the parable is really those who are obedient to the Lord's laws out of respect, reverence, and genuine love for the Lord. Love, after all, is biblically defined as obedience to the Lord's laws, and not some sentimental feeling. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Now, by this, we know that we know him, Lord, if we keep his commandments. He who says, I know him, and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, truly the love of the Lord is perfected in him. By this, we know that we are in him, his fiduciaries. He who says he abides in him as a fiduciary, ought himself also to walk just as Christ walked. Yeah, government instituted slavery using franchise, your all caps letter name. All right. There are 34 chapters in this book. So each one, okay, the first chapter is an introduction on franchises. Then public versus private. 4, public privilege versus private privilege. Rights. 5, hierarchy of sovereignty. The power to create is the power to tax or regulate. 6, franchise agreements generally. 7, types of gov franchises. 8, introduction to the law of agency. 9, franchise terms defined. 10, relationship of domicile to franchises. 11, government franchises may not lawfully be offered to persons domiciled in the constitutional states of the Union and may only be offered to those domiciled on Fed territory, area, or possessions. Effects of participation in franchises. Questions exercised in misusers or non-users of franchise privileges. Penalties under franchise agreements. Criminal provisions within franchise agreements. Proof that statutory citizens' residents are in franchise status that has nothing to do with your domicile. Effects of privileges, franchises, and other special burdens upon equal protection. Licensing. 20. When is a license really a franchise? 21. FTC franchise rule, detailed definition of what constitutes a franchise. Biblical franchises, abuse of franchise by the government. 24. Legislative franchise courts, how statutory franchise and public rights affect your standing in Fed court. Legal standing and status of corporations in federal courts. Court doctrines and statuses used to protecting franchise administration. Defense against government illegal enforcements of franchises in court. Lawfully and avoiding government franchises and licenses. This is what this book talks about right here. Rebutted false arguments of those who disagree with the memorandum. 31. Simple reforms that will prevent most of the gov abuses described in this document. And 23, conclusions and summary. 33, resources for further study and rebuttal. 34, questions that readers and grand jurors and petite jurors should be asking the governments. Yeah, so I'm going to continue reading on this book later. List of tables. Effect of accepting franchises upon your civil status. Public versus private property. Public versus private. Meanings assigned to the United States by the U.S. Supreme Court in Hoven versus Allison versus Evitz. Rules for converting private property to a public use or a public office, public versus private franchise compared, private rights and public privilege compared, privileges versus non-privileged words, two types of rights within the states of the Union, private civil liberties or versus political public rights. Two types of public rights within the Fed zone, Bill of Public Rights for U.S. territories, possessions, and Indian reservations, enumeration of rights, how property ownership transitions from absolute to qualified by exercising your right to contract, effect of land registration, effect of participating in franchises, two methods for taxation, statutory remedies for those compelled to act as public officers, and straw man. Rules for converting private property to a public use or a public office, two methods for taxation, effects of turning government service into a franchise, comparison of franchise court to constitutional court, national versus Fed, rules for converting private property to a public use or a public office, rules for converting private property to a public use or a public office. What the fuck? Okay, list of figures. FIRPTA provision within land sale contract, sovereignties within our system of gov, internal revenue license, operation of unconstitutional conditions doctrine, table of authorities, constitutional provisions, 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 24th Amendment, 26th Amendment, 7th Amendment, Anointed Constitution, year 2002, page 640, Anointed 14th Amendment, Anointed 14th Amendment, Congressional Research Service, Article 4 of Confederation, 1777, Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 8, Article 4, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, Article 80, Section 14, Article 1, 8, Clause 4, Article 1, 8, Article 1, Section 10, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 3, Article 3, Article 3, Section 4D, Governor, Article 4, 2, Clause 1, Article 5, Section 10, Article 1, Article 1, 8, Clause 4, Article 1, Clause 2, Section 3, Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 8, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, Article 1, Section 1, Section 8, Clause 10, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, Article 1, Section 1, Section 8, Clause 3, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 7, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 and 3, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 3, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, Article 3, 2, Article 4 of the USA Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 2, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, Article 4, Section 4, Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution, Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, Article 5, Section 10, Article 7, Section 7, Article 1, Article 1, 2, Clause 3, and 9, Clause 4, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, Article 2, Article 3, Article 3, Section 2, Article 3, Section 2, Paragraph 2, Article 3, Section 25, Article 5, Article 4 of the Articles of Confederation, Article 4 of the Articles of Confederation, 1777, Article 4, 2, Article 4, Section 22, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, Article 4, Section 4, Article 5, Section 12, Article 6, Section 9, Judges, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, Article 1 and 4, Articles of Confederation, Articles of Confederation, Article 4, Articles of Confederation, Article 6, Bill of Rights, California Constitution, Constitution 3, 1870, Article 5, 24, Constitution Amendment 514, Constitution Article 1, 8, Constitution Article 9, 4, 95, Constitution Article 1, Section 11, Constitution Article 1, Section 9, Article Section 1, Section 8, Constitution Article 2, Section 4, Legislator, Constitution Article 2, Section 1, Constitution Article 2, Section 9, Constitution Article 3, Section 10, Constitution Article 3, Section 13, Judges, Constitution Article 3, Section 3, Constitution Article 4, Part 2, Section 4, Constitution Article 4, Section 6, Part B. Constitution Article 4, Section 30, Legislative. Constitution Article 4, Section 6. Constitution Article 4, Section 9. Constitution Article 4, Section 14. Article 5, Section 2. Article 5, Section 7. Article 6, Section 16. Article 6, Section 28. Article 7, Section 4, Executive. Article 8, Section 7, Judges. Article 1, Section 2, Part 3. Article 2, Section 10. Article 2, Section 12. Article 2, Section 14, Legislative. Article 2, Section 2. Article 2, Section 26. Article 2, Section 5. Article 3, Section 1. Article 3, Section 2. Article 3, Section 22, Legislative. Article 3, Section 6. Article 3, Section 7, Legislative. Article 3, Section 8. Article 3, Section 2, Part 4B. Article 3, 9. Article 4, Section 13. Article 4, Section 14, Governor. Article 4, Section 15, Judges. Article 4, Section 2, Executive. Article 4, Section 2E, Legislative. Article 4, Section 3, Senators. Article 4, Section 4, Legislator. Article 4, Section 5. Article 4, Section 8. Article 4, Section 5, Section 3, 4. Article 4, Section 1. Article 4, Section 17, Judges. Article 4, Section 18. Legislative. Article 4, Section 4, Governor. Article 4, Section 7, Judges. Article 4, Section 8. Article 5, Section 9, Office. Article 4, 5, Section 1, Section 3. Article 6, Section 19, Judges. Article 16, Section 20, B1. Article 6, Section 3. Okay. Constitution, Article 6, Section 9. Article 7, Section 9. Articles 8, Section 10, Judges. Article 2, Section 54, Chapter 5, 6. Article 2, Constitution Declaration of Rights. Article 35, Officers. Constitution Declaration of Rights. Article 33, Judge. Constitution of D.C. Article 4, Section 4B, Judges. Constitution Section 973-008. Constitution Section 97-5027. Constitution Sections 253548. Constitution Article 4, Section 4. Constitution Article 3, Constitution of the United States. Constitution Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence 1776. 11th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause of the Federal Constitution. Federal Constitution, Federalist Papers 78, Federalist Paper number 46, Federalist Paper number 78, Alexander Hamilton. Federalist Paper number 79, Federalist Paper number 15, Fifth Amendment Taking Clause, 5th and 14th Amendments, 5th or by the 6th Amendment, 1st Amendment, 14th Amendment, 14th Amendment, Section 1, 14th Amendment, General Welfare Clause, Magna Carta, Chapter 41, 19th Amendment, 9th Amendment, Original, 13th Amendment, Privilege or Immunities Clause, 6th Amendment, 16th Amendment, 6th Amendment, 10th Amendment, the Federalist number 45, page 292, 293, Zero Stair Ed 1961, the Federalist number 51, page 323, Rostair Ed 1961, the Federalist number, I don't even know what that fucking numeral number is. LXXX. The 13th Amendment, the U.S. Constitution, Articles 4, 3, Clause 2, the U.S. Constitution, Article 4, Section 4, the U.S. Constitution, 14th Amendment, U.S. Constitution, Amendment 11, and good Lord, U.S. Constitution, Amendment 14.1, U.S. Constitution, Article 1.8, U.S. Constitution, Article 3, U.S. Constitution, Article 4, States Relations, Section 4, U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, U.S. Constitution, Article 4, Section 4, U.S. Constitution, Article 3, Section 2, U.S. Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, USSA Constitution, USCA Constitution, Article 1, Clause 1, USCA Constitution, Article 1, 8, Article 6, Paragraph 2, USCA Constitution, Article 1, 8, Article 6, Paragraph 2, Amendment 10, U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 3, United States Constitution, Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 5, United States Constitution, Article 3, Section 2, United States Constitution, Article 5, 6, United States Constitution, 5th Amendment, USA Constitution. Statutes. Good Lord. 1 Statute 1 Statute 2324, 1 U.S. Code 204, 10 U.S. Code 333, 12 U.S. Code 1841B, 1994 edition, Soup 3, 13 VSA 3002, 15 U.S. Code 1122A, 15 U.S. Code 4, 15 U.S. Code 77CA2, 15 U.S. Code 78AA, 15 U.S. Code Chapter 1, 15 U.S. Code 89, 16 U.S. Code 363, 16 U.S. Code 423G, 16 U.S. Code 425H, 16 U.S. Code 430AR, 16 U.S. Code 689C, 16 U.S. Code 694B, 16 U.S. Code 701, 17 Stat 401, 17 U.S. Code 511A, 18 PACA 4120, 18 U.S. Code 201-208, 18 U.S. Code 201-210-11, 18 U.S. Code 3 and 4, 18 U.S. Code 912, 201, 208, and 10 and 210, 18 U.S. Code 1001, 18 U.S. Code 1111, 18 U.S. Code 1201, 18 U.S. Code 1346, 18 U.S. Code 1503, 18 U.S. Code 1512, 18 U.S. Code 1542, 18 U.S. Code 1583, 18 U.S. Code 1589, 18 U.S. Code 1589-3, 18 U.S. Code 1593, 18 U.S. Code 1621, 18 U.S. Code 1865b1, 18 U.S. Code 1918, 18 U.S. Code 1951, 18 U.S. Code 1956, 18 U.S. Code 201, 18 U.S. Code 201 and 208, 18 U.S. Code 201 A1, 18 U.S. Code 201, 208, 18 U.S. Code 208, 18 U.S. Code 208, 18 U.S. Code 210, 18 U.S. Code 212, 11, 18 U.S. Code 2381, 18 U.S. Code 2381, treason, 18 U.S. Code 241, 18 U.S. Code 247, 18 U.S. Code 297, 18 U.S. Code 597, 18 U.S. Code 6002, 18 U.S. Code 6401, 18 U.S. Code 654, 18 U.S. Code 872, 18 U.S. Code 876, 18 U.S. Code 880, 18 U.S. Code 911, 18 U.S. Code 9, 18 U.S. Code 9, 12, 210, and 211, 18 U.S. Code 687, 19 U.S. Code 1336I, 19 U.S. Code 401, 20 U.S. Code 212, 20 U.S. Code 212, 20 U.S. Code 2721, 22 U.S. Code, I meant for the last two, Foreign Relations and Intercourse, Section 611, 23 U.S. Code 315, 25 U.S. Code 302, 25 U.S. Code 317, 26 U.S. Code 7443F, 26 U.S. Code 6671B and 7343, 26 U.S. Code 6901 and 6903, 26 U.S. Code 7201 to 7217, 26 U.S. Code 7206, 7207, 26 U.S. Code 7701A, 14 and 13, 16, 26 U.S. Code 7701A, 39 and 2408D, 26 U.S. Code 7701A, 9 and A10, 7701A, 39 and 7408D, 26 U.S. Code 1, 26 U.S. Code 1144116G, 26 U.S. Code 1100, 1952 edition, 26 U.S. Code 1313, good Lord, 26 U.S. Code 1313B, 26 U.S. Code 1402, 26 U.S. Code 1402B, 26 U.S. Code 1461, 26 U.S. Code 162, 26 U.S. Code 2105, 26 U.S. Code 2022B, 1939, 26 U.S. Code 3121E, 26 U.S. Code 3401A6, 26 U.S. Code 3401C, 26 U.S. Code 3401D, 26 U.S. Code 3402P, 26 U.S. Code 3403, 26 U.S. Code 6013G and H, 26 U.S. Code 6020B, 26 U.S. Code 6041, 26 U.S. Code 6041A, 26 U.S. Code 6065, 26 U.S. Code 6109,
26 U.S. Code 61098, 26 U.S. Code 63331, 26 U.S. Code 63318, 26 U.S. Code 643, 26 U.S. Code 6651, 26 U.S. Code 6671, 26 U.S. Code 6671B, 26 U.S. Code 6671B, and 7343, 26 U.S. Code 6901, 26 U.S. Code 6903, 26 U.S. Code 7201. 26 U.S. Code 7201 through 7217, 26 U.S. Code 7203, 26 U.S. Code 7206 and 7207, 26 U.S. Code 7343, 26 U.S. Code 7408D, 26 U.S. Code 7423, 26 U.S. Code 7426, 26 U.S. Code 7434, 26 U.S. Code 7441, 26 U.S. Code 7443E, 26 U.S. Code 76601, 26 U.S. Code 7701, 26 U.S. Code 770181, 26 U.S. Code 7701 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 and 2408D, 26 U.S. Code 7701 26 U.S. Code 7701 26 U.S. Code 7701 26 U.S. Code 7701 and 810, and good Lord. 26 U.S. Code 7701B1A, 26 U.S. Code 7701B1AB, 26 U.S. Code 7701B4, 26 U.S. Code 7701B4B, 26 U.S. Code 7701B5, 26 U.S. Code 7701B4, 26 U.S. Code 7701C, 26 U.S. Code 78058, 26 U.S. Code 86183CI, 26 U.S. Code 871, 26 U.S. Code 8718, 26 U.S. Code 871F, 26 U.S. Code 872, 26 U.S. Code 911, 26 U.S. Code 911D3, 28 U.S. Code 144 and 455, 28 U.S. Code 14455, 28 U.S. Code 754 and 958, 28 U.S. Code 1251, 28 U.S. Code 1332, 28 U.S. Code 1332 A3, 28 U.S. Code 1333, 28 U.S. Code 1334, 28 U.S. Code 1338 A, 28 U.S. Code 1349, 28 U.S. Code 144, 28 U.S. Code 1441, 28 U.S. Code 1446B, 28 U.S. Code 1447C, 28 U.S. Code 1603, 28 U.S. Code 1603B, 28 U.S. Code 1605, 28 U.S. Code 1605A, 28 U.S. Code 1605A2, 28 U.S. Code 1605B1, 28 Code U.S. Code 1605B2, 28 Code 28 U.S. Code 1605B3, 28 U.S. Code 1605B4, 28 Code 1605B6, 28 U.S. Code 1652, 28 U.S. Code 171, 28 Code 1746 1, 28 U.S. Code 17462, 28 U.S. Code 1865, 28 Code U.S. Code 1865B, 28 U.S. Code 2201, 28 U.S. Code 2201A, 28 U.S. Code 2679D, 28 Code 297, 28 U.S. Code 3002 15A, 28 U.S. Code 453, 28 U.S. Code 455, 28 U.S. Code 636, 28 U.S. Code Part 4, Chapter 97, 28 U.S. Code Chapter 97, 28 U.S. Code 1132 EI1 or I, 28 U.S. Code 6525. Good Lord. Okay. What time is it? What the fuck, bro? Why somebody keep randomly sending me money? 3 stat 587, 3 stat 587, section 7, 3 stat at I-26, chapter 60, 23, 30, U.S. Code 7531, U.S. Code 321, 31, U.S. Code 321D, 31, U.S. Code 5324, U.S. 31, U.S. Code 73, 35, U.S. Code 271, H, 4 U.S. Code 105111, 4 U.S. Code 105113, 4 U.S. Code 106, 4 U.S. Code 110, 4 U.S. Code 11 OD, 4 U.S. Code 72169, 42 U.S. Code 1301, 42 U.S. Code 1301A1, 42 U.S. Code 1981, 42 U.S. Code 1981A, 42 U.S. Code 1983, 42 U.S. Code 1994, 42 2000 H4, 42 U.S. Code 408, 42 U.S. Code 408A8, 42 U.S. Code Chapter 21B, 42 U.S. Code Chapter 7, 42 U.S. Code A 1001 Esquire 41 Esquire, 42 U.S. Code A 1101 1004 1011B, 42 U.S.C. A 1101 1110, 42 U.S. Code A 1983, 42 U.S. Code A 1101 1110, 44 U.S. Code 1505, 44 U.S. Code 1505A1, 44 U.S. Code 15 AC2, 46 U.S. Code 5051, 48 U.S. Code 1302, 48 U.S. Code 1421B, 48 U.S. Code 1451, 48 U.S. Code 1561, 48 U.S. Code 1612, 48 U.S. Code 737, 5 U.S. Code 2105, 5 U.S. Code 21058, 5 U.S. Code 5517, 5 U.S. Code 552A1, 5 U.S. Code A 552A2, 5 U.S. Code 552A, 5 U.S. Code 552AA12, 5 U.S. Code 552AA13, 5 U.S. Code 552AA2, 5 U.S. Code 552AB, 5 U.S. Code 553A, 5 U.S. Code 553A1, 5 U.S. Code 553A2, 5 U.S. Code 553B, 50 U.S. Code 841. Good Lord. 720 LLCS 5172, 8 U.S. Code 1101, 821 and 1452, 8 U.S. Code 1101, 8 U.S. Code 1101, 21, 8 U.S. Code 1101, 22, 8 U.S. Code 1101, 820, 8 U.S. Code 1101, 821, 820 U.S. Code 1101, 822, 8 U.S. Code 1102, 1, 822A, 8 U.S. Code 1101, 822B, 8 U.S. Code 1101, 823, 8 U.S. Code 140177, 8 U.S. Code 1401A, 8 U.S. Code 1408, 8 U.S. Code 1448, 8 U.S. Code 1452, 8 U.S. Code 1481, ARS 13206, ARS 132406, ARS 12902, subsection A, AS 1146-160, AS 1156-830, ASC 537-208, Article A, August 13, 1888, C 868-25, Stat 437, January 9, 1883, C 1522, Stat 401, Act of January 29, 1795, C 21, Stat 414, Article 4 of March 26, 1790, C 31, Stat 103, Antenna Life Insurance versus Hartworth et al. 300 U.S. Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, Agricultural Adjustment Act, Anti-Injunction Act 26 U.S. Code 7421, Anti-Injunction Act 26 U.S. Code 7421, Buck Act, the Buck Act of 1940, the Buck Act of 4 U.S. Code 105 through 113, COA 13A 1010, COA Title 13A Article 10, COV 1863, California Civil Code 1903-2260, California Code 678-680, California Code 1589, California Code 22224, California Code 655, California Code 682, Part 3, California Family Code 721, Sanitary Act Sanitary Act of 1925, Civil Code, Cal 1903, 2282, Civil Rights Act Code, GA 1882, 14292, Penn Code 1810, 831, Code of Conduct for United States Judges, Code of Virginia 463281, Corporation Tax Act of 1909, Corporation Tax Law of 1909, DC Code 221404, and good Lord, DC Code Title 11, Section 854, DC Code Title 11, Section 9073, Declaratory Judgment Act of 1934, Declaratory Judgment Act of 28 U.S. Code 2201, Declaratory Judgment Act 28 U.S. Code 2201, Declaratory Judgment Act 28 U.S. Code 2201A, Declaratory Judgment Act codified in 28 U.S. Code Chapter 151, Section 2201 to 202, Federal Insurance Contribution Act of 1935, Federal Reserve Act of 1913, Federal Reserve Act of 1913, Federal Trade Zone Act 1934, 19 U.S. Code 81A, Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, FCIA, Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, 28 U.S. Code 1602, 1611, Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, 28 U.S. Code 1605, Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, 28 U.S. Code 1605A2, Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, 28 U.S. Code Chapter 97, Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, 28 U.S. Code Part 4, Chapter 97, Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, 28 U.S. Code Chapter 97, GLM Chapter 268, Section 33, GLR 1114.1, General Business Law 38S, HR 7260, HRS 710-1016, House of Representatives Ex Doc 99-1867, IC 2531A through 18, IC Title, good Lord, 16, Section 718-2, IR Code 132 and 162, IR Code 501C, IR Code 5011, IR Code Section 667 1B and 7343, IR Code Section A through C, IS 3001, Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 101-822, Indian Revised Laws of 1831, International Revenue Code, Internal Revenue Code, IRC, Internal Revenue Code of 1939, Internal Revenue Code of 1986, Section 7428, Internal Revenue Code Section 132 and 162, Internal Revenue Code Subtitle A, Internal Revenue Code Subtitle A of the U.S. Code, Internal Revenue Code Subtitles A and C, Internal Revenue Code Subtitles A and C, Internal Revenue Code Subtitles A through C, or Invest Company Act of 1940. IRS Reconstruction and Reforms Act, Public Law 105-206, Title 3, Section 3706-112, Statute 778, Judicial Code of 1911, Judicial Code of 1940, Section 1, page 2453-2454, Exhibit 3, KRS 21382, KRS 434-570, KRS 51460, KRS 532034, KRS 61080. Good Lord. Long-Grime Statutes, MC 97743, MCA 457209, MRSI 72323, MS 609475, Mass Revised Laws 1902, Chapter 14212, Penal Code, Chapter 35, Section 7550 17C, Model Penal Code Q223.0, NCGS 14277, NDCC 12-1-1304, NHRS 35912, NJS 82C28A, and MSA 30-16211, NRS 197120, NRS 286386, NRS 28639, OCGA 161023, ORS 162365, ORS 165803, OS Title 21, Section 1533. OS Title 21, Section 1533-1, Obama Health Care Bill, Official Code of Georgia Amendment, OCGA 42-1, PIN code CI 836 Sub D3, Penal Code 4841, Penal Law 19023, Penal Law 19078, Privacy Act 5 U.S. Code 5528A13, Public Law 97164, Public Salary Tax Act of 1939, RCW 187119, RS 14112, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, Rev Civil Code S. Doc 1903, 1639, Rev Civ Codes S. Sodoc Dat 1903, 1651, Rev Code NDIC 1895, 4298, Revenue Act of 1862, Revenue Act of 1926, C2744 Stat Part 2 P 109, 26 USCA 1224 1227, Revenue Act of 1939, 53 Stat 489, Rules of Decision Act 28 U.S. Code 1652, SDLC 224016, SDLC 224080, Section 120111, Securities Act of 1933, Sherman Antitrust Act, Sherman Antitrust Act, Social Security Act, Social Security Act 801, 804, 811B, Social Security Act 201, Esquire 42 USCA 401 Esquire, Social Security Act of 1935, Social Security Act of 1935, at Title 8, Section 8, Social Security Act of 1935, Section 1101A1, Social Security Act of 1901, 910, 901, 910, Social Security Act 42 U.S. Code Chapter 7, Social Security Act Section 8, Social SS Act Title 8, State Vehicle Code. Good Lord. Statutes 8301, Statutes at Large, Statutes at Large, SAL, SAL, TC 39-16301, TS 3251, Tariff Act of 1930, Section 5168F10, Texas Penal Code Anointed 324882, the Social Security Act, the Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Chapter 95, Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Title 26, Title 26 IRC Code of the U.S. Code, Title 28 of the United States Code, Title 42, Title 42 of the U.S. Code, Title 42, Chapter 21, Title 48, Title 48 of the U.S. Code, Title 5 of the U.S. Code, Title 8, Title 8 of the U.S. Code, Title 9, Title 2, Trust Indenture Act of 1939, 15 U.S. Code, Chapter 2A, U.S. Code 768512, UCC 1203, UCC 1202, UCC Code, go back, UC 768512, UCC 1202, UCC 1303, UCC 120111, UCC 1202, UCC 1207, UCC 1308, UCC 21031A, UCC 21041, UCC 2106A, UCC 2206, UCC 22061, UCC 22062 and 3, UCC 2207, UCC 2209, U.S. Code, Uniform Commercial Code, UCC Uniform Probate Code 12018, United States Statutes at Large, Volume 1, Utah Code 594-103-13, Utah Code 594-1013E, Virginia Civil Code March 12, 1819, WS 63901, WS 65307, WS 943201, WVC 615727AE. Good Lord. Okay. Regulations. 16. Code Federal Regulations Parts 4362A1I and 2, 4362AIII. 20 CFR 422103, 20 CFR 422103D, 20 CFR 422101, 22 CFR 517, 22 CFR Foreign Relations Section 9212, 9230, 26 CFR 111 through 1C, 26 CFR 11441 through 1C3, 26 CFR 13212.6, 26 CFR 1469 through 9, 26 CFR 16012 through 1B, 26 CFR 1871 through 1B1I, 26 CFR 18712, 26 CFR 18712B, 26 CFR 18721 through 1, 26 CFR 1872 through 2F, 26 CFR 1441 through 1C3, 26 CFR 301-340-1C1, 26 CFR 301-61091, 26 CFR 301-61091D3, identifying numbers, 26 CFR 301-7715, 26 CFR 31341A6 through 1B, 26 CFR 31341A3, 26 CFR 3134001A3, 26 CFR 3134001C1, 26 CFR 3134001P1, 26 CFR 3134002P1, 26 CFR 601-106F1, 26 CFR 601-70282II, 26 CFR Section 2921 through 1, 1939, 44 Fed Regulation 49964, August 24, 1979, 5 CFR 263501, 101, 5 CFR 2635101A, 5 CFR 2635101B, Federal Register, February 2, 1999, Volume 64, Number 21, page 4967, 4975, Franchise Rule, 16, Code Federal Regulation, Parts 436 and 437, IRS Publications, IRS Regulations, TDC AA13, Federal Register, February 2, 1999, Volume 64, Number 21, page 4967, 4975. The Federal Trade Commission Franchise Rule, 16 CFR 4361 Esquire. Title 20 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Parts 400 through 499. Rules. Brandeis Rules. Fed R. Crim, page 43. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 11. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17B 80. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17D. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 71. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 41A. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 8B6. Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 23A. Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 43. Federal Rule of Evidence 603. Federal Rule of Evidence 610. Fed Rule of Evidence 611C. Fed Rule of Evidence 802. Fed Rule of Evidence 80901A. Hearsay exceptions rule, Fed Rule of Evidence 8038. Hearsay rule, Fed Rule of Evidence 802. Supreme Court Rule 17. Tax Court Rule 13. Tax Court Rule 13A. Tax Court Rule 13A1. U.S. Tax Court Rule 13A. United States Constitution. All right, these are the cases. The cases. Okay. I am not about to read the motherfucking cases. Anywho, here they are. The King versus Sir William Luther. 1 Strange R. 2 Duchess 398. 2 LD RAYM. 2 Mass 84, 20 California, 350, 36 Vermont, 486, 3 LA, 137, 3 Metcalf, 520, 4 Co 118, 4 Co 24B, 11 ID 87A, 44 Liquor Mart, Inc. versus Rhode Island, 517 US, 484, 1996, 5 Cratch 2999, 6 Match 358, 7 Cratch 144, 8 Wall 168, 19 LED 357, 9N Chapter 20, A. Baldwin and Company versus McCain, Abad versus Detroit, Abad versus Detroit Board of Education, Abad versus Detroit Board of Education, Abad versus Brodstein, Abad versus Vance Jack, Acton versus Henderson, Adam versus Charter Communications, Adkiss versus Crest Company, Antenna Life Insurance Company versus Haworth, Ephraim versus Rusk, Agnew versus United States, Alabama versus Arizona, Allen versus Maine, Allen versus Forrest, Allen versus Graham, Allen versus Graham, Allen versus Reagans. Alliant Tech Systems Inc. versus Salt Lake City Board of Equalization. Alice Stores of Ohio Inc. versus Bowers. American Banana Company versus U.S. Fruit. American Institution Company versus Santer. American Service Corp of South Carolina versus Hickle. American Steel Foundries versus Robertson. Andrew versus O'Grady. Anti-Fascist Community versus McGrath. APAC Mississippi Inc. versus Deep South Appeal of Shishko. Wow. Application of where? Arizona versus California. Arizona versus California. Arkansas, Missouri. Power Company versus Brown. Arnett versus Kennedy. Arsons versus Murphy. Ashton versus Camerson County Water Improvement District. Ashworth versus Tennessee Valley Auth. Ashton versus Tennessee Valley Authority. Ashton versus Tennessee Valley Authority. Ashwinder versus Tennessee Valley Authority. Ashton versus Yvette. Ashton Mills versus Johnson. Atkins versus United States. Atlantic and GR Company versus Georgia. Atlantic Coastline R Company versus Ivy. Atlas Roofing Company versus Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission. Atlas Roofing Company versus Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission. Attorney General versus Sewell. Attorney General versus Weeks Bernie. Exchange Representative Austin versus Labart. Babby versus Randy. Bailey versus Alabama. Baker versus Montana Petroleum Company. Biles versus S&M. Baltimore versus Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company versus Chambers. Bastex versus Puerto Rico. Bastex versus Puerto Rico. Bank of Augusta versus Earl. Bank of Augusta versus Earl. Bank of Augusta versus Earl. Bank of Augusta versus San Francisco. Bank of Commerce and Trust Company versus Senator. Bank of Commerce versus New York. Bank of United States versus DeVox. Bank of Tax Case 2 Wall 200. Bank of Earl. Banks versus Mayor. Burnett versus National Bank. Bassett versus Etcheberry. Bird versus U.S. Bursley versus Cunningham. Bank versus Vincent Park Hotel Corp. Bank versus Missouri Valley Drainage District of Holt County. Beer Company versus Massachusetts, Pierce versus Arkansas, Bell versus Person, Bell versus United States, Belleville versus Citizens, Horse, Benton Harbor versus Michigan Fuel and Light Company, Barrett College versus Kentucky, Barrett College versus Kentucky, Billings versus Hull, Black River Imp Company versus Hallway, Lodgeville Vouch, Blair versus Chicago, Blake versus McClure, Blaine versus United States, Blue Island versus Coles, Boards of County, Commerce of County versus Students in Idaho, Boards of Education of Westside County versus Community Schools versus Magdalen by the Through Mergens, Board of Education versus County Board of School Trustees, Board of Regents versus Roth, Boards of Regents versus Roth, Paula and Bala, Body versus Connecticut, Vogel versus Vogel, Boise Arts and Cold Water Company versus Boise City, Bolivar Board of Finances of Benton County versus Hawkins, Bonpart versus Tax Court, Boone versus Clerk, Boone versus Merchants and Farmers Bank, Burns versus Hayes, Balta versus Rollins, Sconta versus Bonlogos, Bowers versus Dodoma, Empire, Bowen versus Virginia State Entomologist, Boyd versus State of Nebraska, Boyd of State versus State of Nebraska, Boykins versus Alabama, Bradley versus Bradley, Bradley versus U.S., Bradley versus U.S., Brandon versus County of Benil, Brown v. Winkle, Burnley Events, Burnley Thresher Company, Brewery Williams, Bridgeport v. New York versus New York, Berkeley versus Hudson, Broderick versus Oklahoma, Berkeley versus Jansen's, Berkeley versus Simpson, Brooks versus State, Brown versus Bandit, Ford Inc., Brown versus Brennan, Brown versus Demco, Brown versus Gardner, Brown versus Merlo, Bush versus Union Pacific Railroad Company, Brown versus Net, Buck Mountain Coal Company versus Leh Coal and Nave Company, Buckler versus Hilt, Buckley versus Vallejo, Bud versus People of the State of New York, Bull versus United States, Bergen versus Forbes, Burt versus Brooks, Burton versus United States, Burton versus Wellington Park Authority, Butchers Union Company versus Crescent City Company, Butchers Union versus Crescent City, Butterworth versus U.S., CIR versus Trustees, CAHA versus U.S., Cather versus Bull, Keller versus Jones, California versus Compost Band of Mission Indians, California versus Carney, California versus Green, California versus Green, California versus Taylor, Camden versus Allen, Camarero versus United States, Carly and Hamilton versus Snook, Charlesley versus U.S., Charlesley versus United States, Cameron versus Bodwin, Carson versus Fed Finance and Credit Company, Carson versus U.S., Carroll versus United States, Carter versus Carter Coal Company, Carter versus Carter Coal Company, Carter versus Carter Coal Company, Carter versus Curtis, case number 100CVO311O EGS, case versus Terrell, Gallette versus Catworth, Catlin versus Trustees, Central Pack R Company versus California Central Transportation Company versus Pullman's Palace Car Company, Cahino versus State By and Through State Highway Commission, Chase Champing versus U.S., Chase Champing versus U.S., Champlain Refining Company versus Cruz, Charles River Bridge versus Warren Bridge, Chase C. Stewart Mass Company versus Davis, Cheltenham TP versus Cheltenham, TP Police Department, Chicago and CR Company versus Chicago, Chicago and Grand Trunk RY versus Wellman, Chicago and WIRC Company versus Dunbar, Chicago Board of Trade versus People, Chicago XL Cohen versus Green, Chicago General R Company versus Chicago, Chicago Motor Coach versus Chicago, Chicago Park District versus Henry, Chicago versus Chicago Union Transaction Company, Chasco Cotton Oil versus Cotton County. Children's Hospital, Shishole versus Georgia. 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 Champaign versus United States. Chrysler's Light MP Company versus Benfield. Cincinnati versus Cincinnati Traction Company. Citizens Telco versus Cincinnati. City of Aurora versus Flores. City of Aurora, Flores versus Flores. Archbishop of San Antonio. City of Louisiana versus Shelby Guardian. City of Mobile versus Muckwell Oil. City or Company versus Citizen Street or Company. Civil Service Common versus Letter Carrier. Clerk versus United States. Clarksburg Silver Electric Light Company versus Clarksburg. Clausen versus United States. Clearfield Trust Company versus United States. Cleveland Bed Board Bed of Ed versus La Flor. Cleveland versus Cleveland City. Clyde versus United States. Clyde versus United States. Clyde versus United States. Cohen versus Delaware. Cohen versus Virginia versus Cohen versus Virginia. Claudy versus Franklin. Claudy versus Franklin. Cole versus Housing Authority of City of Newark. Coleman versus Thomas. College Savings Bank versus Florida Prepaid Secondary Education Expense. Collins versus Connecticut. Colonial Motor Coach Corporation versus City of Austria. Colorado and SR Company versus FT Collins. Glosswalker versus United States. Columbus versus and Greenville versus Miller. Columbus R Power and L Company versus Columbus. Comia versus Vass. Commissioner of Internal Revenue versus Palash. Commissioner versus Chapario. Commonwealth versus Alger. Commonwealth versus Long. Commonwealth versus Smith. Commonwealth versus Watson. Commonwealth Department of Highways versus Pfister. Commonwealth versus Davis. Corona Fire Insurance Company versus Illinois. Commonwealth versus General Construction Company. Conwick versus Mayors. Conazo versus General American Life Insurance. Cook versus Singer Sewing Machine Company. Cook versus United States. Cook versus United States. Cook versus Villanary. Kernfield versus Coriel. Corporation Commission versus Lowe. Cotting versus Goddard. Cotton versus United States. Court in Estelle versus Williams. Court of Appeals of New York. Cox versus Terminal R. And Cox versus Coy versus Iowa. Good Lord. That's a lot of motherfucking cars. Chris versus Floyd. Cross versus Harris. Crash versus Bennett. Carwell versus Benson. Carwell versus Benson. Carwell versus Benson. Conley versus United States. Cougar County. Process versus Director. Corporation versus Myrtle. Cumberland Telephone versus Telephone Company. And United Electric. Cummings and Commonwealth. Corton versus State. DMR Ferry and Company versus United States. Dartmouth College Woodward. Dartmouth College Woodward. Dartmouth College Woodward. Data versus Stava Division versus New Orleans. Davis versus Alaska. Davis versus Dallas. Davis versus New York. Dayton versus North Carolina Street Road Company. D-Crude U.S. versus U.S. D-Crude versus United States. Variance versus Brush Creeks Coal Company. DeCarlo versus Garland Inc. Decker versus Bolavo Smith Corp. Delaware and CR Company versus Pennsylvania. Delaware versus Finsteel. Delaware versus Vandar. Delaware versus Velash. Damerton versus United States. Department of Mental Hygiene versus Birchman. Devon versus Scott. Dyke versus State. Damik versus Vink. Dismute versus United States. Division of Aid for the Aged, etc. versus Hogan. Domison versus Commissioner. Dole versus Bolton. Dole versus Hogan. Dolan versus City of Tagar. Dollar Savings Company Bank versus United States. Bowl versus Lilly. Bodwell versus United States. Donner versus Lavox. Doans versus Bidwell. Oh, Bidwell from the Robots movie. Dover versus Continental Inc. Dowell versus Michelle Browse. Dowell versus Michelle Browse Company. Dowell Collector versus Michelle Browse. Dred Scott versus Stanford. Dred Scott versus Stanford. Dred Scott versus Stanford. Dred Scott versus Stanford. DeHay versus Arcacia Moods Life Insurance Company. Duffer versus Stancy. Duffer versus Evans. East Ohio Gas Company versus Akron. Economy, plumbing, and heating versus U.S. Economy, plumbing, and heating versus United States. Adler versus Francier. Edmondson versus Linsfield Concrete Company. Edward versus Arizona. Edwards versus Cuba Railroad. Edwards versus United States. Eston versus Brad. Eisner versus Mokmar. Electric Company versus Dow. Electric Company versus Dow. Electric Elliott versus City of Eugene. Ellicott versus Eugene. Ellis versus Boston. Isron versus Burns. Insight versus U.S. Energy Reserves Group Inc. versus Kansas Power and Light Company. Earlier Railroad versus Tompkins. Evans versus Corman. Evans versus Gore. Evans versus Gore. Evans versus Board of Ed. Ex parte Atacha. Ex parte Backlight Corporation. Ex parte Blaine. LR. Ex parte Bradley. Ex parte Ferrier. Ex parte Milligan. Ex parte Polite. Ex parte Randolph. Ex parte State Ex Rel Attorney General. Ex parte Virginia. Extension of Hancock Street. Fairchild vs. Hagen. Fairchild vs. Hughes. Farmers and Mechanics National Bank versus Deerings. Poultry versus Lum. FCC versus League of Women Voters of California. Federal Radio Commission versus General Electric Company. First versus Housing Authority of Cass County. Fertilizing Company versus Hyde Park. Fidelity National Bank versus Swap. Thinking Gonson Gondom Enterprise Limited. Fireside Nissan Inc. versus Fannings. Fisher versus United States. Filter versus Filter. Fisher versus Porter Memorial Hospital. Flax versus City of Richmond. Fleming versus Nestor. Fleming versus Nestor. Fleming versus Nestor. Fletcher versus Turtle. Fletcher versus Turtle. Phillips versus Stone Tracy Company. Flint versus Stone Tracy. Flora versus U.S. Gold. Flora versus United States. Floyd versus Miller Lombard. Floyd Brothers Inc. versus Floyd. Fung Fu Ting versus United States. Fung Fu Ting United States. Fung Fu versus Louisiana. Fountain Park County versus Swenser. Fox versus Standard Oil Company. Fox versus United States of Ohio. Franklin County versus Public Utilities Company. Franklin Fire Inc. versus Knoll. France versus Zimmer. Fraternal Order of Police, Metropolitan-Dade County Lodge Number 6 versus Department of State. Frazier versus State of Tax Commission. Freitag versus Commissioner. 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 Frost and Frost Tracking Company versus Railroad Commission of California. Frost versus Railroad Commission. Frost versus Railroad Commission of Fry versus United States. Smith versus Shrugs. Fuentes versus Schiffin. Love versus Walk-On. Fulton Light Heat and Company versus State. Gaines versus Buford. Gant versus Oklahoma. Lander versus Portland. Groves versus City. Sac Bank. Cotton Concrete Products Inc. versus Riley. General Electric Co. versus Chicago. Gentle versus State Bar of Nevada. GOB Violets Inc. versus PFOS. Georgia Department of Human Services versus Sistrunk. Georgia R&M Power Company versus Atlanta. Georgia v. Evans. Gibbons versus Darden. Glidden Company versus Glenn's Dock. Glenberg versus Kelly. Hamilton versus Linkfoot. Gridrock versus Everest. Gordon's versus U.S. Gordon's versus United States. Golden versus Golden. Grand Trunk Company. Grand Fashion. Grand Vest versus Ordine. Grand Mass versus Ordine. Graphic Arts Friend versus Inc. versus Boston Redevelopment Authority. Gravis versus Peoples of the State of New York. Great Falls Manufacturing Company versus Attorney General. Good Lord. Great Falls Manufacturing Company versus Attorney General. Great Falls Company versus Attorney General. Great Falls versus Attorney General. Green versus Department of Public Welfare of the State of Delaware. Green versus McCullough. Green versus Louisiana Power and Light Company. Gregory versus Ashcroft. Gregory versus Rockford. Griffin versus California. Griffin versus Illinois. Griffiths versus United States. Griffith versus States. Griffith Force versus Connecticut. Griffson versus American Press Company. Griff Jean versus American Press Company. Gross Jean versus American Press Company. Glinting versus State. Gunnin versus United States. Gulf Refining Company versus Cleveland. Gulf C Company versus Ellis, Hager versus Reclaiming District, Halley versus Henkel, Hale versus Hay County Board of Elections, Hale versus Wingate, Hamilton versus New Jersey Real Estate Commission, Departments of Institution, Hammer versus Danhart, Hammond versus Hot Shop Bus Line, Hanson versus Renaud, Hanson versus Renaud, Hanson versus Renaud, Harrison versus Hotchkiss, Hartman versus Versus, Harper versus Virginia State Board of Elections, Bartz versus Harrison, Harrell versus Tabarnia, Harrison versus City of Beverly Hills, Harris versus Harris, Harris versus McRae, Hatch versus Carpenter, Hatch versus Radar, Harper's Case, Howell versus District of Columbia, Heart of Atlanta Motel Inc. versus United States, Hillian versus Estate Matter, Heiner versus Donna, Heiner versus Donna, Welsford versus Davis Court, Harvard's Commissioner of Internal Revenue versus Davis, Hendricks versus Maryland, Henry versus Parsonsville's Gas and Oil Company, Herrick versus Randolph, Harriet versus City of Seattle, Higgins versus Downward, Hill versus St. Louis, Hill versus U.S., Higgs versus John Hancock Mute Life Insurance Company, Hobbs versus McLean. Good Lord. Oh. Hooper versus Tax Commissioner, Hoffman versus Kinley, Holden versus Harley, Houghton Civic Club versus City of Hossens, Hossens Inc. versus Hutton's Homes Inc. Company of New York versus Morris, Helvin and Allen's Company versus Evac Housing Authority of Cherokee National of Oklahoma versus Langley, Howie Stud Civil L89, Hova versus Baldwin, Hopper versus Amron, Hudson County News Company versus Seals, Hodges versus Alexandria Scraps Company, Hodges versus United States, Hugh versus U.S., Hummer's Executor versus United States, Hurtado versus California, Husband versus Husband, ICC versus Louisiana, Enrique Balas Estates, Enrique Balangros, Enrique Durant County School District, Enrique Goodwin, Enrique Hamilton, Enrique Honey's Estate, Enrique Jacob, Enrique Jones Estate, Enrique Lane's Estate, Enrique DeClamar's Will, Enrique Reder, Enrique Mills, Enrique Mencher, Enrique Knott, Enrique O'Donnell Estate, Enrique Olmsted, Enrique Opening Froment Street, Enrique Public Railway Committee, Enrique Promise, Enrique Riggle, Enrique Ruffle, Enrique Turner, Enrique Van Cleek, Enrique Winship, Enrique Young, Enrique Munson, Indian State Isthmic Commissioner, Nelson, Ingram versus Wright, Inland Navigations Company versus Chambers, Inland Waterways Company versus Louisiana, INS versus Shanghai Insurance Company of North America versus China Insurance Company versus New Orleans, International Harvester Company versus Connecticut, International Harvester Company versus State of Mississippi, International News Service versus Associated Press, International Shoe Company versus Washington International Trust Company versus American LT Company. Hold up, International Trust Company versus American Airshore R Terminal Company versus Public Utilities Company, Airways Aviation versus Cincy Board of Equalization, EU County California versus Palacio Indians, Awa versus Tavar, Airway versus Gawat, Abajo Irrigation District versus McCarthy, J.E. Rumble, Jack Coal Company versus McLean, Jackson versus Rossbond, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, Jeffrey versus State, James versus Bowen, John Miller versus Romero, Jay versus Boyd, Royal versus Cordell, Robert, Hershey City versus Hagu, Hug, Johnson versus Consolidated, Johnson versus Harvey, Johnson versus Service, Johnson versus Hellman, Johnson versus United States, Hilbert versus German, Hagi versus State versus St. Paul Co-op, Kaiser Renetta versus United States, Kaiser Renetta versus United States, Kansas Gas and E Company versus Independence, Kansas versus Hendricks, Corral versus United States, Corral versus City of Sterling Heights, Kanstar versus United States, Kazakh versus Brandon, Kozlowski versus Kozlowski, Keller versus Potomac Electric Company, Keller versus Potomac Electric Power Company, Keller versus State Bar of California, Keller versus State, Keller versus Florida, Keller versus Johnson, Keller versus Carson, Kent versus Dulles, Kentucky versus Denson, Kentucky versus Sinister, Keller and Thompson, King versus Marriott, Kirby versus Shaw, Kirby versus United States, Condon Mandel versus Mandel, Constance versus Chicago Park District, Coho versus United States, Colga versus United States Superior Court, Courts versus City of Petersburg, Lorton, Torrance versus Manchester, Laborton versus General Gas Company, Lacey versus State, Lafayette versus Louisiana Power and Light Company, Lake versus Lake, Lamar versus Berman Racing, Lane County versus Oregon, Lane County, Lanham versus State, Lancet versus New Jersey, Largate versus Texas, Largate versus Arthurs, Larson versus South Carolina, Larsher versus People, Larsher versus People, Lazier versus Department of Social Services, Dunham City, Larthur versus Donahue, Lawrence versus J.H. Cross, Lawrence versus Robot, Lawrence versus Oregon, Lawrence versus Texas, Lurie versus United States, Lehman Tire and Sales Company versus Burbick, Lipa versus Railway Company, Lavosk versus Cunningham, Lavosk versus Truly, Lavosk versus Cunningham, Lucy versus Hardin, Leonard versus Biden Street Wharf Company, Leonard versus Wurzburg, Leonard versus Wurzburg, Levezar versus Field, Liberty Warehouse Company versus Grenades, Liberty Warehouse Company versus Grenades, Liberty Warehouse Company versus Tobacco Growers, license cases, license tax cases, Legar versus Chicago, Light versus the United States, Linneman, Lambert Scott versus Lander, Liquor Store versus Continental Distilling Corporation, Little versus Smith, Liverpool, New York versus Immigration Commissioners, Livingston versus Mayor, Loan Association versus Topeka. Good Lord. Long versus Rumsons, Lord versus Equitable Life Insurance, Lord versus Wazee, Loretto versus Teleporter Manhattan, Lombard versus Blake, Louisville versus Cumberland Telephone and Telephone Company, Louisville v. Lewis versus Louis Home Tel Company, Lavelle versus Griffin, Loving versus Virginia, Lugar versus Edmiston Oil Company, Luria versus United States, Luther versus Burden, Lynch versus Household Finance Corporation, M. Itzvots and Sons versus Gargati, M. Claus versus State. Good Lord. Manchester versus Street, Manchester versus Ohio Elections Commissions, Manchester versus Hare, Macy versus Heron, Madden versus Queens County Jockey Club, Moderna Water Works versus Madera, Madison versus Madison Gas E Company, Madler versus Finley, Madler versus Finley, Madler versus Finley, Magley versus Brown, Bahar versus Roll, Malloy versus Hogan, Malloy versus Alexander Auto Service Company, Manley versus Georgia, Manning versus Lennon, Manning versus Bentley, Mesher versus City of Sacramento, Manufacturing Company versus Corn Products Company, Marsalis versus City of Chicago, Marbury versus Madison, Murphy 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 versus Madison, Marsh versus Alabama, Marston versus Louisiana, Martin versus Maud, Martin versus Walton, Martinez versus Myron, Massachusetts versus Malton, Massachusetts versus Malton, Massachusetts versus United States, Mass Foods and Company versus MFG Company, Master of Adoption of Boohoo, Matter of a Mayor of New York, Matter of Miller, Maxwell versus Bow, Maxwell versus Bow, Mac Allister versus United States, McCarthy versus Ardenstein, McCarthy versus Hinman, McCollum versus Dallas County, McCollum versus Maryland, McCollum versus Maryland, McCollum versus MD, McCollum versus United States, State of Maryland. Okay, interesting. McCune versus Light, Maduro versus Gold, McLean versus Taylor, McLean versus International Life Insurance, McClarger versus Berwin, McKinston versus Dill. Good Lord. McLary versus Commonwealth. McCoot versus Lyle, McLean versus the United States. McMahon versus Richardson, McMullen versus Maryland, McCollum versus Maryland, Millbury versus United States, Manise versus Keene, Manise versus Keene, Memorial Hospital versus McCormick County, Memphis Street, R County versus Rapid Transit Company, Merchants L and T Company versus Shamak, Meredith versus United States, Meredith versus United States, Mayor versus Nebraska, Mayor versus Nebraska, Mayors 311 U.S. Michael Running Wolf versus State of Texas, Michigan Employment C Commissions versus Pats, Miles versus Safe Deposit Count, Milham versus Sharp, Miller Brothers Company versus Maryland, Millers versus United States, McLean versus Mayors, Millers versus Board of Counties Commerce of Lawrence, Mills versus Rogers, Milwaukee versus White, Milwaukee Company of Jehovah's Witness versus Mullen, Minnesota versus Mill Lax Band of Chewand Indians, Minor versus Martin, Minot versus Morton, Miranda versus Arizona, Miranda versus Arizona, Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians versus Highfield, Mississippi Bank of Choctaw Indians versus Hanfield, Missouri Pacific Railway versus Nebraska, Missouri K&T Railway Company versus Dewey Portland Cement Company, Mohan versus City of Cocoa, Manuel versus New York City Department, Montana Power Company versus Paquin, Moores versus White, Walkley versus United States, Moore versus East Cleveland, Mercantile Bank versus City of New York, Moorhead versus State Department of Roads, Morgan versus Louisiana, Missouri versus Brewer, Mount Hope Cemetery versus Boston, Mugglers versus Kansas, Mullen versus Central Governor Banking Trust Company, Mullen versus Central Governor Trust Company, Mullane versus Central Governor Trust Company, Moon versus Illinois, Moon versus Illinois, Moonsville versus Illinois, Moon versus Illinois, Murdoch versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Murdoch versus Pennsylvania, Murphy versus Ramsey, Murphy's versus City of Charleston, Murphy's Lindsay versus about land improvements, Muskrat versus United States, Muskrat versus United States, NAACP versus Booton, Nashville C and St. Elray Company versus Wallens, National Bank versus County of Yankton, National Electric Signaling Company versus Telephone, National League of Cities versus Surgery, Murray versus Illinois, New Jersey versus Sargent, New Orleans Gas Company versus Louisiana Light Company, New Orleans Gas Company versus Louisiana Light Company, New Orleans Gas Light Company versus Louisiana Light Company, New Orleans versus Houston, New Orleans versus Payne, New York City Transit Authority versus Bizarre, Empire Case, New York Electric Lines Company versus Empire City Subway Company, New York versus Illinois, New York versus United States, New York versus United States, New Bern versus Barnes, New Block versus Bells, Nigerians versus Sanchez, Nicholas versus U.S., Nicholas versus Nuklakov versus Archbishop of Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church. What? Nishmar Out versus United States, Nolan versus California Coastal Common, Norman versus City of Las Vegas, Northern Liberties versus St. John's Church, Northern Ohio Traction and Light Company versus Ohio Northern Pipeline Company versus Marathon Pipeline Company, Northern Pipeline Company versus Marathon Pipeline Company, Northwest Tel Exchange Company versus Anderson, Northwest Tel Exchange Company versus Minneapolis, Norton versus Shelby Coast State of Tennessee, Norton versus Shelby Coast State of Tennessee, Norton versus Shelby County, Norton versus Shelby County, Norwell versus Norwell, O'Connor versus Ortega, Old Donahue versus United States, Olone versus Estate of Shabazz, O'Malley versus Murmur, O'Neill versus United States, O'Douglas versus United States, O'Fah versus United States, Ohio,
Public Service County versus Ohio, Ohio versus Roberts, Oklahoma versus Civil Service Commission, Old Colony Trust Company versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue, Old Colony Trust Company versus Commissioner, Old Colony Trust Company versus Commissioner, Old Misted versus United States. Good Lord. Omaha Walter Company versus Omaha, O'Malley versus Merrill, O'Neill versus United States, Opinion of Judges, 8 Greenland Oriental Company versus DAG, Osborne versus Banks of the U.S., Osborne versus Bank of U.S., Osborne versus United States of Bank, Osborne versus Cumberland Telephone and Telephone Company, Omni B. Morgan, Osborne versus United States, Pack versus Southwestern Bell Telephone and Telephone Company, Padford Fay and Company versus Mayor and Almerton of City of Savannah, Palmer versus U.S. Civil Service Commissioner, T.C., Pennsylvania versus Allen, Parham versus J.R., Parrish versus McVeigh, Parrish versus Railroad, Parrish versus Taylor, Parson versus Kentucky, Patton versus Catacona, Paul versus Virginia, Paulton versus Reliance Inc. Company, Penn Coal Company versus Bohan, Pioneer versus Neff, Pioneer versus Neff, Pennsylvania Arco versus Bowers, Pennsylvania versus Ritchie, People X Rail, Attorney General versus Utka Ames Comp, People X Rail, Central Hudson Gas and Company versus States Tax Com, People X Rail, Foley versus Stapson, People X Rail, Harvard versus Line, Bigfoot X Rail, Jackson versus Summer Our Company, People X Rail, Salary Tax Club versus Lynn, People of Territory of Guam versus Vancouver, People versus Brown, People versus Merle, People versus Monroe, People versus Purvetta, People versus Rath, People versus Wrigley, People versus Rushworth, People versus Shacklefnaw, People versus State Tax Commerce, People versus Stanler, People versus Inca Inc., People versus Williams, People Uncomplete of McDowell versus Gisno, People's Pass R Company versus Memphis City, Perkins versus Egla, Perry versus Centerman, Perry versus U.S., Perry versus United States, Perry versus United States, Perry versus United States, Persons versus City of Greenville. Good Lord. PTV versus Penn, Pfizer Inc. versus Government of India, Fallon versus Virginia, Philadelphia versus Fox, Pierce versus Emory, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, Pierce versus Society of Sisters, Pierce versus Somerset Rye, Pierce versus Somerset Rye. Pierce versus Somerset Rye, Pierce versus Somerset Rye, Pierce versus Pierce Y. Emory, Pila versus American Bar Association, Pioneer Mining Company versus Tyberg, Pickup Branch Bank versus Knock, Plessy Ferguson versus Ferguson, Poindexter versus Greenhow, Poindexter versus Greenhow, Punchers versus R.E. Gibson Body Shop, Polkey County versus Donson, Paulin versus Hagen, Paulins Leslie versus Hagen, Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, Pollock versus Farmers Trust Company, Poplar Bluff versus Poplar Bluff Loan, Puerto Rico Railroad Light and Power Company versus Colin, Puerto Rico Potsdam Creole Cereal Company versus California Fig Nut Company, Postum Cereal Company versus California Fig Nut Company, Pablo versus Alabama, Power MFG Co. versus Sanders, Power Inc. and Huntley, Prey versus Northern Liberties, Presser versus People of the State of Illinois, Price versus United States, Prig versus Pennsylvania, Prince versus Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Principal of Companies, Lavaria, Protector of Charles River Bridge versus Procurers of Rock Bridge, Providence Bank versus Billings, Providence Bank versus Billings, Providence Bank versus Billings, Providence Gas Company versus Thurbar, Prudential Inc. Company of America versus Chick, Public Workers versus Mitchell, Publicly versus Green Bay Company, Clinton versus Wallach, Kimby versus Public Service, Burchell versus Hutchins, Railroad Company versus Alabama, Railroad Company versus Tennessee, Railroad Company versus Jackson, Railroad Company versus Panson, Railroad Company Department versus Hanson, Rabba versus Fines, Ohio Company, Reed Board of Fire Commerce, Reed Primes Estates, Real Estate Commissioner, Recent and Railroad versus Sims, Railside versus Rockler, Verher versus Fisher, Redfield versus Fisher, Ritz versus People of the State of Michigan, Reagan versus Taxation with Representation of Washington, Ronix versus Smith, Reno versus Flores, Rhinos versus United States, Rice versus Kinston, Richard versus Virginia Ray, Richard Concrete Company versus City of Readings, Rick versus Governor, Riggs versus Nevada, Reach Company versus Lost County, Robert versus Robert, Robert versus Robert, Roberts versus United States, Joyce's, Rower versus Superior Court, Rogers versus Belly, Romer versus Evans, Rozier versus Rockefeller, Roslin versus California Board of Pharmacy, Rojas versus Griffin, Russell versus New York, Robin versus U.S., Rockenbaugh versus Mullins, Rundle XL versus Delaware, and Rotten Canal Company. I said Cantal. Rushville versus Rushville Natural Gas Company, Russells versus Sebastian, Russell Social Federated Soviet Republic versus Cabrillo, Rush versus Savannah, Rutan versus Republican Party of Illinois, Rutan versus Republican Party of Illinois, Rutland Electric Light Company versus Marble City Electric Light Company, Ryan versus Motor Credit Company, Sacramento Orphanage and Children's Home versus Chambers, Shansby Roll versus Roll, Salt Lake City versus Utah Light and Tractions Company, San Diego Building Trades Council, etc. versus Glamron, San Francisco Arts and Athletes Inc. versus United States Olympic Committee, Sanham versus Naya, Sanger versus City of Brankport, Sexton versus Carmer, Savage versus Martin, Sancho versus Martin, Chester Poultry Cart Corporation versus United States, Chester versus Wisconsin, Chester versus State Sopra, Chagrin versus City of Albany, Chigrander versus New York, Schultz versus New York State's Executive, Schultz-Wasner versus Fred Martin Motor Company, Second Russian Inc. County versus Miller, Sustenance of Town of Nahua versus U.S. D.C. Mass, Shell versus United States, Cell versus United States, Slovar Base versus and County, I'm almost done, versus Washington, Seminole Tribe of Fla versus Florida, Senior Citizens League versus Department of Social Security, Summer 8 Orthodox Citizens versus Molavok, Shafar versus Natar, Shamrock Oil versus Gas Corporation versus Sheets, Caprior versus Thomas, Shapiro versus Thomas, Shaw versus Asheville, Shelley versus Nair, Shelley versus Nair, Shelley versus Creamer, Shemdell versus City of Qatar, Shelton versus Tucker, Shepard versus Maxwell, Shepard versus Nerver, Shishko versus State Farms Insurance, Sheport Traction Company versus Report, Sheffield versus City of Burlington, Alabama, Shibert versus Department of Alcohol Beverage Control, Shimber versus Office Leaders Corporation, Silver versus Silver, Singer versus U.S. Sinking Fund Cases, Sinker versus Oklahoma, Sickner versus Oklahoma, Slaughterhouse Cases, Linder versus Hardin, Smith Engineer Works versus Custer, Smith Sessors and Sons Inc. versus South Carolina, Procurement Review Panel, Smith versus Albright, Smith versus King, Smith versus Longman, Smith versus Reynolds, Smith versus Smith, Nation versus Family Finance Corp, South Carolina versus Consulac, South Carolina versus Regan, South Carolina versus United States, South Carolina Gold Company versus Amador Gold Company, South Putin versus Jessup, Southern Promotions LT versus Conrad, Southern Express Company versus Pardon, Southern Pacific Company versus Lowell, Southern Pacific Company versus Lowell, Shit, where was I? Okay, Sellers versus Ohio Civil Rights Commission, Spicer versus Randall, Spencer versus United States, Freckles Sugar Refining Company, Spring versus Constantino, Springwell, Walter Worth versus Barber, Springs versus Philippines Island, Sprout versus Southern Bend, St. Louis Casting Company versus President's Constructions Company, St. Louis Military Company, Company versus Brennan Gas Construction Company, St. Louis Mineral Casting Company versus Brennan Gas Construction Company, St. Louis Company versus George C. Sander Oil Company of California versus Perkins, Sander Oil versus U.S., Stanley versus Illinois, Stanley versus Illinois, Stanley versus Illinois, Stanley versus Illinois, Staten versus Baltic Mining, Staten versus Baltic Mining, State Board of Tax Commercials versus Jackson, States XRL Clam versus Minnesota Thresher, States XL Colorado River Commissioner versus Froth Miller, States XRL Daniel versus Broad River Power Company, States XRL Houghton versus Baton Rouge, States XRL Kansas City versus Eastern Federation, States XRL Lee versus Darius, States XRL Martin versus Ohio Electric Power Company, States XRL Martin SO, Nami Eltel versus Stobie Justice of the Peace, State XRL Michigan versus Stage Stores Company, States XRL Naga versus Sylvan, States XRL National Surgical Corporation versus Price, States XRL Chevab versus Iowa Tel Company, States XRL versus New York Life Insurance Company, States XRL Watkins versus Fernandez, States XRL Weatherly versus Burlington Waterworks Company, States XRL Williamson versus Garrison, States of Wisconsin versus Pelican Insurance Company, State Tax on Foreign Held Bonds, State versus Allen, State versus Pets, State versus Black Diamond Company, States versus Branham, States versus Carter, States versus Clausen, State versus Cushing, State versus Fernandez, State versus Gibbs, States versus Gilbon, States versus Greenstead, State versus Hine, State versus Harlow, States versus Harrington, State versus Hez, States versus Chemin, State versus Jack, State versus Landon, State versus Noble, State versus Northwestern Electric Company, States versus Oldham, States versus Real Estate Banks, State versus Savage, State versus Sokol, State versus Shundy, State versus St. Phillips, States versus Topeka Water Company, States versus Witherby, States versus Webb, States with Watkins versus U.S., States Staten Island Rapid Transit Railroad Company versus Phoenix, Dimity, States versus Maurice, States versus Maurice, Steers versus Forland, Steed versus Harvey, Steve versus Imperial Airlines, Steinberg versus Cohort Stevens versus Cherokee Nation, Stevens versus State, Stevenson versus Fane, Stewart Machines Company versus Davis, Stewart Dry Goods Company versus Louise Stockton Gas and E Company versus St. Joaquin County, Stockwell versus United States, Stone versus Mississippi, Stone versus Mississippi, Story versus Sexton, Strongton versus Baker, Stockton versus Stowe versus Bank, Stratton's Independence versus Hubbard, Stratton's Independence versus Hubbard, Stratton's Independence versus Hubbard, Strawn Mercantile Company versus First National Bank of Texas, Civil Appeals, Solder versus Solder, Summers versus United States, Somerville versus Georgia Power Company, Supreme Court of New Hampshire versus Piper, Sweet versus Painter, Swift versus State, Swiss National Inc. versus Company versus Miller, Tally versus California, Tappan versus Merchants National Bank, Terry versus Adams, Texas versus Interstate Commerce Commission, Texas versus U.S., Texas versus White, the NSLB, the Betsy, the City of Panama, the Collector versus Day, the Davis, the Exchange, the Kansas Indians, the Siren, Dom versus New York Stock Exchange, Doms versus Hugham. I'm almost done. I'm in the U's. I'm close. Thomas versus Housing and Redevelopment Authority of Dulce. Thomas versus People. Thomas versus Shapiro. Thornborough versus Robot, Thorpe versus RB Railroad, Thorpe versus Rulham and Burlington Railroad, Thorpe versus London, Trenton County versus Rogers Locomotive and Machine Works, Tacoma, Tamawak versus United States, Top versus United States, Towers versus Towers, Crown of Arlington versus BDs of Coalition and Appreciation, Trademark Cases, Terminal versus United States, Trinity. Oh my goodness. Trip. Where was I? Good Lord. Okay. Trademark cases. Terminal versus United States. Trinity Episcopal Corporation versus Remini. Trio Distributor Corporation versus City of Albany. Travel versus Grantsville. Trox versus Carrington. Trustees of Durham College versus Woodward. Trustees of Phillips Eastern Academy versus Exeter. Tuana versus USA. Tulsa Professional Collection Services Inc. versus Pope. Toomey versus Ohio. Turner versus Bank of North America. Turner versus Louisiana. Turner versus Southley. Turner versus United States. Turner versus United States. Turpin versus Limon. Tooten versus United States. Newber versus Summey. Tooten versus United States. Tyler versus the judges. U.S. XL. Brookfield Co. versus Stewart. U.S. Supreme Court in the United States versus William M. Butler. U.S. versus Bangkok. U.S. versus Bink. U.S. versus Brown. D.C. U.S. versus Butler. U.S. versus Butler. U.S. versus Clark. U.S. versus Cruikshank. U.S. versus Camford. U.S. versus Johnson. U.S. versus Lamb. U.S. versus Lee. U.S. versus McLaurin. U.S. versus O'Keefe. U.S. versus Perkins. U.S. versus Pruden. U.S. versus Smith. U.S. versus Speller. U.S. versus Texas. U.S. versus Thompson. U.S. versus Toby. U.S. versus Union Pack Roll Company. U.S. versus United Mine Workers. U.S. versus Valentine. U.S. versus White Ridge. U.S. versus Will. U.S. versus William M. Butler. Uniform Sanitation Men SN Inc. versus Commissioner of Sanitation of City of New York. Union Pacific R Company versus Passport. Union Refrigerator Transit Company versus Connecticut. United States XL Rail Angria versus Bayard. United States XL Rail Dunlap versus Black. United States Railroad Retirement Board versus Fritz. United States Rock Weston versus City Council of Charleston. United States Trust Company of New York versus New York. United States versus Bangkok. United States versus Bangkok. United States versus Bass. United States versus Bostwick. United States versus Bowlin. United States versus Bowlin. United States versus Brown. United States versus Barron. United States versus Chamberlain. United States versus Classic. United States versus Cleveland Indians Baseball Company. United States versus Collins. United States versus Cooper Corporations. United States versus Kerrigan. United States versus Chronic. United States versus Cruikshank. United States versus Erie Art Company. United States versus Erie Art Company. United States versus Ferreira. United States versus Jinxburg. United States versus Goodwin. United States versus Garriott. United States versus Guest. United States versus Guest. United States versus Herman. United States versus Harris. United States versus Harris. United States versus Holzer. United States versus Holzer. United States versus Lanham. United States versus Lanning. United States versus Lee. United States versus Little. United States versus Little. United States versus Lovett. United States versus Lutz. United States versus Maurice. United States versus Maurice. United States versus National Exchange Bank of Baltimore. United States versus Feliz. United States versus Pueblo of San Adolfo. United States versus Reese. United States versus San Francisco. United States versus St. Chuck. United States versus State of Bank. United States versus Supply Bladel Company. United States versus West Virginia. United States versus Will et al. United States versus Wingstop Corporation. United States versus Wrong King Arc. United States versus Royal. United States U.S. versus DeWitt. United States versus Griff. Utah Farms Bureau Inc. Company versus Utah Inc. Guarantees Association. Utah Light and Traction Company versus Public Service Company. Van Brooklyn versus United States of Tennessee. Van Brooklyn versus Tennessee. Van Colton versus Van Colton, Van Riper versus Constitutional Government League, Van Wingberg versus Brown, Wingbergs, Van Horn's Lease versus Warrens, Vaughan versus States, Vermont Agency of Natural Resources versus United States, Victoria versus Victoria, Victory Cab Company versus Charlotte, Virginia Cannon Toll Road Company versus People, Virginia's Concrete Company versus Port of Cypress of Fairfax County, Virginia Western Power Company versus Commonwealth, Valandes versus Klein versus Valandes versus Klein, Valandes versus Klein, Wages versus States, Walton versus Ridge, Wall versus Parrot Silver and Copper Company, 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 Walton versus City of Atlanta, Waltz versus Taxcom, Washington versus Glucksburg, Washington versus Texas, Waterloo, Water Company versus Village of Waterloo, Webster's versus Reproductive Health Services, Webster versus Venter, Weiner versus State Department of Roads, Westfield versus City of Seattle, West Coast Disposable Service Inc., West versus West, Western Union Telegraphic Company versus Learn Roots, Westport versus Mulholland, Wheeling Street Corporation versus Glander, Whitebeck versus Funk, White versus Howard, Whiting versus Town of Wesley, Whiting versus Whitney versus California, Wickard versus Filburn, Winhunt's case, 1887, Wilbur Manufacturing Company versus Corn Products Company. I'm almost done. Wixland versus Linland, Will versus Michigan Department of State Police, Williams versus Hoffman, William versus Shapiro, William versus U.S., William versus United States, William versus Vermont, Willing versus Chicago Auditorium, William versus Chicago Auditorium Association, Williner versus Committee of Characters and Fitness, Wilshire Oil Company versus United States, Wilson versus Shaw, Wilson versus Omaha Indian Tribe, Wingmax 36, Wisconsin versus Pelican Insurance Company, Wisconsin versus Pelican Insurance Company, Wisconsin versus Yoder, Wolf versus McDonald, Wang Yang Song versus McGraw-Roth, Woolley versus Maynard, Woolham versus Nussmore, Worldwide Volkswagen Corporation versus Woodson, Worldwide Volkswagen versus Woodson, Wright versus Milwaukee Electric Car and Light Company, Wyman versus James, Yahoo Inc. versus La Ligue contre le Rasmus et la Admastin, Yasny versus Golf, Yegwo versus Hopkins, 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 Young versus Moorhead, Wong Kong England versus Trinidad. Other authorities. Okay. Against the Cows Company decision in the aluminum patent integration case, times William Howard Taft, National Park Service, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, Kingdom of Heaven defined in Scripture, taxpayer versus taxpayer, which one are you? The decline and fall of the Athenian Republic, Alexander Fraser Tyler, unconstitutional conditions, 1 Bishkrim Law, 143, 1 Blackstone's Come 4756, 1 Bell Institution 83, 1 Hamilton Works Ed 1885, 1 J. Bauer A. Law Dictionary adapted to the Constitution and laws of the United States of America, 1 Barrison's on Contracts, 7 1 Story of the Constitution, 1 W. Blackstone Commissaries, 1 W. Blackstone Commissaries, 10 Beck R. 264, 12 American Jurisprudence, 2nd edition Bonds, 16 American Jurisprudence, 2nd edition Constitutional Law, 16 Corporis Juris Sanctum Constitutional Law, 1620 Charter of the New England, 1629 Charter of Massachusetts, 1632 Charter of Maryland, 1663 Charter of Carolina, 16A American Jurisprudence, second edition constitutional law, 16A Corpus Juris Sanctum constitutional law, 16B American Jurisprudence constitutional law, state citizenship and its religious, 1774 State of Violation of Rights, 1 Journals of the Continental Congression, 68 1904, 19 Corpus Juris Sanctum Corporations, 2 B and C, 2 BL Com, 2 BL Com, 2 Bow Institutions, 2 Bows Institution, 2 Instant, 2 Instant, 2 Mart Low, 2 Vest, 2 W. Roski Politics and the Constitution of the History of the United States, 8, 21 Conglobe, 22 Conglobe, 25 American Jurisprudence, Highway Section, 26 American and England, 27A American Jurisprudence, second edition, Entertainment and Sports Law, 22A Singers Sutherland on Statutes and Statutory Construction, 3 BLM, 3 Black Com, 3 Com Instant, 3 Com, 3 H. Stephen Commentaries of the Land Laws of England, 3 5 American Jurisprudence, 2 edition, Fidelity Bonds and Insurance, 3 5 American Jurisprudence, Fish and Game, Franchise, Aliens and Citizens, 4B1, Com 5 Bow Instant, 40 American Jurisprudence, Housing Laws and Urban Development, 42 American Jurisprudence, Initiative and Referendum, 44 Congressional Record, 2447, 1909, 44 Congressional Record, 4237, 4239, 1909, 44 Congressional Record, 4420, 44 Congressional Record, 4420, July 12, 1909. Congressman Heflin talking about the enactment of the 16th Amendment, 47 American Jurisprudence, 50 Congressional Record, page 3839, 1913, 51 American Jurisprudence, License and Permits, 6 words and phrases, American Jurisprudence, Public Officers and Employees, American Jurisprudence, Public Officers and Employees, 63C American Jurisprudence, Public Officers and Employees, 7 Corporate Juris Sanctum, Attorney and Client, 71 American Jurisprudence, State and Local Taxation, Yellen Law, Corporate Juris Sanctum, Privileges and Immunities of Citizens of the United States and Columbia University Studies in History, Economics and Public Law, a treatise on franchises, a treatise of the law of agency and contract and tort, a treatise of the law of non-residents and foreign corporations as administered in the state and federal courts of the United States, Contrarino, a treatise on the law of public officers and officers, a treatise on the laws of public and officers and officers, a treatise of the law of public officers and officers, a trustee's handbook, ABCs of the UFC, American Bar Association, about IRS Form W8 Ben, about IRS Form W8 Ben 4, about SSNs and TINs on Gov forms and correspondences, about SSNs and TINs on Gov forms and correspondences, Abraham Lincoln, Abrahams, Howard E. Systematic coercion on constitutional conditions in the criminal law, Ackerman, Constitutional Politics, Constitutional Law, Administrative Law and Proceedings in a Nutshell, Adventures in Legal Land, Affidavit of Citizenship, Domicile and Tax Status, Affidavit of Corporation Denial, Affidavit of Duress, Legal Tax Enforcement by de facto officers, Agreement on Coordination of Tax Administration, Agreement on Corporation of Tax Administration, Alabama Board of Funeral Service, Alexis D. Tocqueville, amended IRS Form W.A. Penn, American Bar Association, American Jurisprudence on Evidence, Franchise, United States Constitutional Law, Legal Encyclopedia, an elementary enterprise on the common law, intricacy of the common law of the U.S. of students, on the use of students, an inquiry into the nature and cause of the wealth of nations, Adam Smith, Anderson's Manual for Notaries Public, Andrew Jackson and the Bank of the United States, by Stan V. Hankels, Anointed 14th Amendment Congressional Research Service, Anonymous Note Constitutional Conditions, 732 Harvard Law Revised, June 1960, Application for a Taxpayer Identification Number 10, IRS Form W-9, Application for the Social Card SSA Form SS5, Arab Spring, Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand, Avoid Gov Franchise and Licenses Liberty University, Ayn Rand, B-Sign Supreme Court's Constitution, Bank of the United States, Ben Ali, Berman, Mitchell, and Commercial Speech in the Constitutional Conditions Doctrine. A second look at the greater includes the lessers. Black's Laws Dictionary, 1910, 4th edition, 6th edition, 5th edition, and that's the Black's Laws Dictionary, all of the same one. Board of Tax Appeals, Bob Schultz, We the People Foundation of Constitutional Education, Bowers Laws Dictionary, 8th edition, unbridged, Bowers Laws Dictionary, 1856, Broom's Legal Maxims, Bureau of Internal Revenue, Caesar, Catching the Wild Pigs, Certificate Proof Affidavit of Service, Chandler Kent, Charles de Montaigne, Charles Evans Hughes, Chief Justice Berger, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Rehnquist, Chief Justice Lord Ellenborough, Cincinnati Law School, 2006, Williams Howard Taft Lecture on Constitutional Law, Citizenship Diagrams, Citizenship Status versus Tax Status, Citizenship Domicile and Tax Status, Civil Causes of Action in Litigation, Colit 126, Collector of Internal Revenue in Michigan, Colonel Edward Mandel Housen stated in private meetings with Woodrow Wilson, President 1913 to 1921, Commentaries on Equity Jurisprudence, Volume 3, 14th edition, Joseph Story, 1922, Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx, Confucius 500 BC, God Globe, 39th Congression, First Session, 1866, Congrove Congression, Statement of Representative Hale, Congress, Congressional Debate on the 16th Amendment, Congressional Record on the United States Senate, June 16, 1909, Congressional Record, June 16, 1909, Congressional Record, Senate, Volume 77, Congressional Research Service, Congressional James Trafficant, Congressional Heffen, Congressional Tort Action, Cooley, Constance Lim, Corporate Takeover of the U.S. Gov well underway, Corporatization and Privatization of the Gov, Corporatization and Privatization of the Gov, Legal Standing and Status of Corporations in Fed Court, Corpus Juris Sanctum, Domicile, Corrada Robert L., Justifying a Search for Undefined Theory of Constitutional Conditions, Corrected Information Return Attachment Letter, Correcting Erroneous Information Returns, Correcting Erroneous IRS Form 1040 and 1098s and 1099s and W-2s, Correcting Erroneous Counterfeit Gods, Tim Keller, Court of Claims, Court of International Trade, Court Remedies for Sovereigns, Taxation Litigation Tool, Currency Transaction Report, Cynthia Mills, IRS Disclosure Officer, D. Curry, the Constitution in the Supreme Court, de facto government scam, De Juro Maurice, De Tocqueville, Declaration of Independence, Defending Your Rights to Travel, Declaration of Authority Order from Lord to Christ, Demand for Verified Evidence of Trade or Business Activity, Currency Transaction Report, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, Chapter 4, 5, 6, and 14. Department of Justice. Department of Justice admits under penalty of perjury that the IRS is not an agency of the Fed Gov. Department of Motor Vehicles. Department of the Treasury. DESC on taxation. Devil's Advocate movie clip. Dig 50 17145. District of Criminals. Dr. Jackson, E.B. White, Edward White, Alice Gardner, Harold Pinter, Theater Signaler, Voice False Silent, USA Today, Employee Identification Number, Application Permanent Amended Notice. Edich on International Statutes, Enumeration of Inalienable Rights. Epstein, Richard A. Forward, unconstitutional conditions, state power, and the limits of consent. Epstein, Richard A. Unconstitutional conditions. Howard Law Revision, November 1988. Executive Order 12731. Fair Trade Commission, FTC, Family Constitution, Family Guardianship Fellowship, Family Issues and Feminism page, Family Law, Dating, Marriage, and Divorce page, Farber Daniel A. Another View of the Quagmire Unconstitutional Condition and Contract Theory, Federal and State Constitution, Colonial Charters, and Other Organic Laws, Fed and State Tax Withholding Options for Private Employees, Federal and State Tax Withholding Options for Private Employers, Fed Circuit Courts, Fed Civil Trials and Evidence, Fed Courts and the IRS. Own IRM says the IRS is not responsible for its actions or its words or for following its own written procedures. Fed Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, Fed District and Circuit Courts, Fed District Court, Fed Enforcement Authority within State of the Union, Fed Forms of Publications, Fed Jurisdiction, Fed Pleading, Motion, Petition, Attachment, Litigation Tool, Fed Reserve Counterfeiting Franchise, Fed Tax Withholding Form, Fed Trade Commission, Informal Staff Advisory Options, Flawed Tax Agreements to Avoid, Forbes Magazines, Foundations of Freedom, Founding Fathers, Fourth Branch of Government, Franchise Rule, Fair Trade Commissions, Frank Herbert D. The Saudi Experiment, Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States, Second Inaugural Address, January 20, 1937, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, FTC Franchise Rule Compliance Guide, May 2008, Full Payment Rule, Funk and Wagnall's New Practical Standard Dictionary, 1946, Godfrey Bloomberg, October 28, 2001, Head Games. It all started with Ross Fear, Terrorism, The History of Very Frightening Word. George Bernard Shaw, George Washington, Letter to Patrick Henry, not October 1775, George Washington's Farewell Address. Getting a USA passport as a state national. God the Father. Lord the Father. Gov. Burden of proof. Gov. Conspiracy to destroy the separation of powers. Gov. Establishment of religion. Gov. Franchise course. Gov. Has become idolatry and a false religion. Gov. Identity theft. Gov. Institutionalized slavery using franchise. Gov. Instituted slavery using franchise. Gov. Instituted slavery using franchise. Gov. Mafia. Clayton Richardson. The Great IRS Hoax. Book. Gross Karen. Debtor as modern day peon. A problem of unconstitutional conditions. 65 Notre Dame Law Revision 165, 1989. Guide to Asking Questions. Hale, Robert L. Unconstitutional Conditions and Constitutional Rights. Harrison, Reconstruction of Privileges or Immunities Clause. Helen Herron, Heritage Foundation website. Hers, Walter, 1999. William Howard Taft, Unitarian Universalist Historical Society. Hierarchy of Sovereignty. The power to create is the power to tax. Hoffman, Bruce, Inside Terrorism, Columbia University Press. House of Representatives, ex-doc. How the U.S. Gov has made itself into the equivalent of a totalitarian monarch. How the World Works, John Perkins. How to Leave the Gov Farm. If the IRS were selling used cars. Income taxation of real estate sales. Injury Defense Franchise and Agreement. Institute for Justice. Internal Revenue Manual. Internal Revenue Service. International Bar Association, IBA. Invisible Contracts. George Mercier. I edits Form 1040 Instruction Booklet. I edits Due Process Meeting Handout. I edits Enrolled Agent Program. I edits Form 1040, 1040 Booklet, 1040 NR, 1042S, 1042S Instructions. I edits Form 4852. I edits Form 56 Noting Consulting Fiduciary Relationship. I edits Form 68AC. I edits Form 8233. I edits Form W2. I edits Form W4. I edits Form W8 Ben. I edits Form 1040 or 1040 NR. I edits Form 42 and W3. I edits Form W2, 1042S 1098 and 1099. I edits Form W2, 104S 988, 999 and K1. I edits Form W4 or 1040, W4 or W8, W7 or W9, IRS Publications 519, I edits Published Products Catalog 2003, page F15, J. Ellie Democracy and Distrust 28, 1980, Jailhouse Lawyer's Handbook, James Madison, Jeffrey Dickinson, Christ is an Jesus in an Antichrist, James Ranford, John Birch Society, John Doe, Judge Andrew Napolitan says the Declaration of Independence is law enacted by Congress. Exhibit 03006, Judge Story, Justice Barshraw, Washington, Justice Scalia, Justice Story, Kathleen M. Sullivan, Unconstitutional Conditions, Cats Fed, Legislative Courts, King Congress, King George, Kingdom of Heaven, Law and Gov page, Lawfully Avoiding the Military Draft, Legal Deception, Propaganda and Fraud, Legal Notice of Change and Domicile Citizenship Records and Divorce from the United States, Legal Remedies for the Protection of Private Rights, Legal Requirements to File Fed Income Tax Returns, London Dock Company, Lance Der Spooner, M. Curtis, No State Shall Abridge, Mark Twain, Market Dominance, How Firms Gain, Hold, or Lose It, and Impact on Economic Performance, for Gore Publishers via Greenwood Publishing Group. Matthew Henry's Commentary on the Whole Bible, Henry M., 1996. Monzon Jason, The Waiver Paradox. McNell, Michael W. Unconstitutional Condition, Unrecognized Implications for the Establishment Cause. Member Agreement, Merriam-Webster's 11th Colgate Dictionary, Merrill Maurice H. Unconstitutional Conditions. Microsoft Encarta, 2008. Copy, 1993. Microsoft Corporation Military and War Page. Minnesota Economic Liberty Institution for Justice. Mirror Image Rule. Mark D. Angelis on YouTube. Malice FC, 2003. Paraface Merriam-Webster's Dictionary, 11th edition. Almost done. Okay. Muhammad Bazazi, Mr. Chief Justice Tenney, Mr. Coates, Mr. Hyde, Mr. Justice Cardozo, Mr. Justice Chase, Mr. Justice Matthews, Mr. Justice Miller, Mr. Justice Story, National Association of Sovereign People, Negative Arraignments for Illegal Tax Collections, New Bible Dictionary, 3rd edition, by Wood D.R.W., Interrecitory, New Hampshire Resolution 10, Nice Julie A. Making conditions constitutional by attaching them to welfare. The dangers of selective contextual ignorance of the unconstitutional conditions doctrine. Ninth Circuit Court of Fed Appeals, non-resident, non-person position, notice of pseudonym use and unreliable IRS records. O'Neill Robert M. Unconstitutional conditions, welfare benefits with strings attached. Origins and authority of the Internal Revenue Service. Oscar Stilley, Our Government Has Become Idolatry and a False Religion. Overview of America. Pastor David Jeremiah of Turning Point Ministries. Path to Freedom. Peterson E.H., 2005, The Message, the Bible in Contemporary Language. Petition for Admission to Practice. Philander Knox, Philosophy of Liberty. Peaceburg Production Company. Public Jurisdiction. Political Rights versus Citizenship Status. Bullet, The Right of Confrontation, Its History and Modern Dress. Ponzi Scheme. President Andrew Jackson, President Barack Obama, President Benjamin Harrison, President James Monroe, President Nixon, President Obama. President Obama says U.S. will not impose its political or economic system on anyone. President of the United States, President Ronald W. Reagan, President Theodore Roosevelt, opening of the Jamestown Exposition, Norfolk, VA, April 26, 1907. President William Howard Taft, Presumption, Chief Weapon for Unlawfully Enlarging Fed Jurisdiction. Principles of Constitutional Law, Judge Cooley. Privacy Agreement. Private versus Public Property Rights and Protection Playlist. Proof that there is a straw man. Property and Privacy Protection page. Prosecuting tax defier and sovereign citizens cases frequently asked questions. U.S. Attorney Bulletin, Volume 61, Number 2, March 2013. Prosecutor of Hamilton County, Ohio. Protection from Competition, Not for Consumers Institution for Justice. R. Brieger, Government by Judiciary. Randy Lee, Readings on the History of and System of the Common Law, 2nd edition. Reasonable Belief About Income Tax Liability. Reasonable Belief About Income Tax Liability. Raleigh Allen, Unconstitutional Conditions on Welfare Eligibility. Representative Marble, requirements for consent, requirements for due process of law, requirements for equal protection and equal treatment, requirements for reasonable notice, resignation of compelled Social Security trustee, responding to a criminal tax indictment, litigation, tool, reinstatements, second edition contracts, reinstatement, second edition trusts, Richard II, Act 1, Section 1, Robertson, 1933, Word, pictures in the New Testament, Roman Governor Faustus Roscoe Pound, Rules of Presumption and Statutory Interpretation Litigation, Ryan C.C., 1971, A Survey of Bible Doctrine, SC2 Heron, Samuel Adams, 1772, Sakalia J. Shiner Frederick, Too Hard on Constitutional Conditions in the Chimera of Constitutional Conspiracy, Schmidt Alex and Jungmann Albert, Political Terrorism, A New Guide to Actors, Authors, Concepts, Databases, Theories, in Literature, Amsterdam, New York, Holland, Secretary of State, Section 1983, Litigation Tool, Section 1983, Litigation Tool, Shegwig's Statutory Constitutional, okay, SEDM, President Obama's inauguration speech, publications page, jurisdiction database, Libertarian University, avoiding gov franchises and licenses, litigation tools, member agreement, Senator Daniel of Virginia, Senator Sam Ervin during Watergate hearing, separations between public and private, separations of powers doctrine, Sheila Companion, silence as a weapon in defense and legal discovery, Simmons, Kenneth W., officers' threats and constitutional conditions, Sir Matthew Hale, 16th Amendment, Congressional Smith on modern law of municipal corporations, Social Security Administration, enumeration at birth programs, Social Security Calculator, Heritage Foundation, Social Security Card and Number, Policy Manual, Form, Program Operation Manual System, POMS, Social Security Program Operations Manual System, Social Security Mark of the Beast, Socialism, the New American Civil Religion, Socialism, the New American Civil Religion, Socialism, the New American Civil Religion, undermining and destroying the civil religions of socialism using the gov's main recruitment mechanism. So society AZ blessed, but gov is evil. Thomas Paine, Sovereignty Marriage, Sovereignty and Freedom page, Sovereignty Forms and Instructions, Your Civil Status, Sovereignty Forms and Instructions, SSA Form 521, SSA Form SS5, SSA Form 5, SSA or SSA in 521 or SS4 or SS5. State Actions Doctrine, State Legal Resources, Stefan Molinox, Stephen Miller, Story on Conflicts of Laws, Story, Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, 5th edition, Volume 1, Sullivan, McLean M., Government Interest and Unconstitutional Conditions Law, a case study in categorizing and balancing, Sullivan, Kathleen M., Constitutional Conditions, Sunstein, Case R., Is There an Unconstitutional Conditions Doctrine? Sunstein, Case R., Why the Unconstitutional Conditions Doctrine is an anachronism. With particular reference to religion, speech, and abortion, Supreme Court of Alabama, Supreme Court of California, Supreme Court of Vermont, Suspicious Activity Report, SAR, Sutherland on Statutory Constructions, TDAA13, TDAA13, Federal Register, February 2nd, 1999, Volume 64, Number 21. Tax Forms Attachments, Tax Protesters, Gets Fed Prison Time, Yahoo News, 5/23/2003, taxation of churches and churchgoers, the Trader Business Scam, the Church in Satan City, March 20th, 2016, Pastor David Jeremiah on YouTube, the Citizenship Contract, George Mercier, the Coming Crisis, How Gov Dependency Threatens America's Freedom, Jim Diminitz, Heritage Foundation, The Complete Book of U.S. Presidents by William A. DiGregorio, The Fall of Rome and Modern Parallels Video Foundation for Economic Education, The Fall of Rome and Modern Parallels Video, Stephen Malongs, The Fall of Rome and Modern Parallel Videos Written Version, Foundation for Economics Education, The Gov Benefits Scam, The Law of Nations, Book 1, Section 223, The Laws of Nations, Vantel, Book, The Law of Frederick Beziat, The Massachusetts Resolves and Prolonged to Revolution, Sources and Documents on the Stamp Act Crisis, The Money Scam, The Privilege and Immunities of State Citizenship, The Real Matrix, Stefan Monox, The Spirit of Laws, Charles D. Monox, 1758, The Tax Courts, The Truth About Trusts, The Virginia Resolves, There's no statute making anyone liable to pay IRC Subtitle A income tax. There is no form. This form is your form. UCC Battle of the Forms. Mark Dingalis, YouTube. This form is your form. Mark DeAngelis. Thomas Jefferson to Charles Mahad, to Giordano Grandar, to John Taylor, Thomas Jefferson to Thomas Ritchie, First Inaugural Address, March 4, 1801, Autobiography, Virginia Allowance Bill 1778, Thomas Ritchie, Title of Nobility, Torrance Act System, Trading Away Your Freedom by Foreign Entanglements, John Birch Society, Treasures Circular 230, Treasury Order 15002, Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, Trustee on Gov, Joel Tiffany, Trustee on Gov, Joel Tiffany, 1867, Trustee on the Law of Public Officers and Public Offices, Trust Fever. Trust Fever is 2, Divide and Conquer, Trust, Invisible Snares, Tanzania honors birthplace of Arab Spring, CBS News, December 17, 2011. 2 political jurisdictions, National Gov and Fed Gov. U.S. Supreme Court, U.S. Attorney Bulletin, U.S. Department of Justice, U.S. District Court, U.S. Gov, U.S. of A versus U.S. Richard D. White Kelly, U.S. Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court Building, U.S. Tax Court, Uncle Big Brother, Unconstitutional Conditions Doctrine, United States Courts of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, United States Department of Justice, United States District Courts, United States Supreme Court, Unlicensed Parties of Law, Practice of Law, USA Passport Application Attachment, and Section 6 Definitions, Virginia General Assembly, Voltaire, Voter Registration Attachment, W. Henderson, A Dictionary of Law, 261, 1893, W.J.V. Windier, Lecture on Legal History, Wald, Patricia M., Gov Benefits, A New Look at an Old Gift Horse, Webster's Ninth New Collect Dictionary, 1983, What Happened to Justice, What is Law Practice, Who are taxpayers and who need a taxpayer identification number, Why are conservatives so mean, Andrew McLavin, Why domicile and becoming a taxpayer requires your consent, Why domicile and becoming a taxpayer requires your consent, Why is it illegal for me to request or use a taxpayer identification number, Why statutory civil laws is law for Gov and not private persons, Why the Gov can't lawfully assess human beings with an income tax liability without their consent, Why you are a national, state, national, and constitutional but not statutory citizen. Why you are a national, state, national, and constitutional but not statutory citizen. Why you are a national, state, national, and constitutional but not statutory citizen. Why you are not eligible for Social Security. Why you aren't subject to the draft or selective service program. Why you don't want to hire an attorney. Why you shouldn't cite Fed statutes for protecting your rights. Why your gov is either a thief or you are a public officer for income tax purposes. Wikipedia topic, the Communist Manifesto. Wikipedia topic, definition of terrorism, 2011. Wikipedia topic, William Howard Taft. Wikipedia topic, 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution download, 2014. Wallowa Constitutional Law, Volume 1, page 213. Winston Churchill, Woolridge on the Law of Waters. Wrong party notice. You're not a statutory citizen under Internal Revenue Code. You're not a statutory resident under the IRS. You are exclusive right to declare or establish your civil status. Your rights as a non-taxpayer. And here are the scriptures.